Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Afternoon. The first item of business today is portfolio questions, and the first portfolio this afternoon is Deputy First Minister Responsibilities, Economy and Gaelic. I remind members that questions 1 and 7 are grouped together and that I'll take any supplementaries on these questions after both have been answered, and otherwise, of course, members who wish to request a supplementary question should press the request to speak buttons during the relevant question. At question number 1, I call Alec Coe-Hamilton.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether its decision not to make survivors of abuse at Fornethy House eligible for Scotland's redress scheme was due to budgetary pressures.
Deputy First Minister.
No, and I want to push back very robustly on any suggestion that it was. This decision was not made lightly. The existing eligibility criteria reflect the core purpose of Scotland's redress scheme as approved by Parliament, which was designed primarily for those vulnerable children in long-term care, often isolated with limited or no contact with their families. Inquiries conducted by an independent researcher indicate that this was not the position of Fornethy survivors, although it in no way diminishes the abhorrent experiences of those survivors. I will meet with members of the Fornethy Survivors Group next week to discuss their concerns directly.
Alex Coe-Hamilton.
I'm grateful for that reply. Presiding Officer, the abuse that the Fornethy women endured as children is utterly appalling. Anyone who has met with them can't help but feel a sense of fury at what they suffered and an admiration at their brave plight and fight for justice. And now they face the further injustice of being excluded from a scheme which exists to compensate people like them who were abused in care as children. Why? Fundamentally, because they just weren't abused for long enough. Last year, John Swinney said he believed, and I quote, "It was possible for Fornethy survivors to be successful in applying under the redress scheme," but this position has clearly changed. Does the Deputy First Minister recognise that by excluding the women from the redress scheme, she has not just denied them access to that compensation, but denied official recognition by the state and ultimately their quest for justice?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I refute that characterisation of the decision completely. I am also deeply sorry to hear what Fornethy survivors had to endure as children, the impact that abuse has had on their lives and the abhorrent experiences that they had. And I commend their courage in sharing those experiences. These are extremely weighty and difficult matters which we have tried to balance carefully. As I already said to the members, I will meet with Fornethy Survivors Group and we will work to see what else can be done to support those survivors.
And I call it question 7, Sue Webber.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government for what reason it decided that survivors of abuse at Fornethy House should not be eligible to access Scotland's redress scheme.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I determined not to amend the eligibility criteria of Scotland's redress scheme after deep and careful consideration, because I believe that it continues to reflect the core purpose, which was approved by Parliament following a public consultation, and the views of survivors, which is paramount. That core eligibility criteria was to provide redress for vulnerable children in long-term care, often isolated, limited or no contact with their families. Decisions on individual applications are rightfully a matter for Redress Scotland.
Sue Webber.
Survivors at Fornethy House they are shocked, disgusted and angry. The Citizen Participation in Public's Petitions Committee said a unanimous view was that the Fornethy survivors should be included in the scheme. And on the 12th of January 2023, then Deputy First Minister John Swinney stated to my committee, "I do not believe that as things stand, there is an inherent impediment to applications to the redress scheme coming forward from people who spent time at Fornethy. To put it slightly more bluntly, I reject the idea that the scheme is not for Fornethy survivors. I think that it's possible for Fornethy survivors to be successful in applying under the scheme." So what's changed, Deputy First Minister? And with the women who are now started a billboard campaign in their fight for compensation, what will you say to them when you meet them later this week?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, what I will say to them is quite rightly to be said to them first. Because they are the ones who have come forward and shared their experiences, and they have had to endure abhorrent abuse. As the member will know, the previous Deputy First Minister met with representatives of the Fornethy Survivors Group to discuss the findings of the independent research report that was commissioned to consider these matters quite directly. And while in no way diminishing the experiences of those survivors, it was recognised during the passage of the original legislation that eligibility was to reflect those in long-term care with limited or no contact with their families. But as I said, Presiding Officer, I will meet with the Fornethy Survivors Group and I look forward to engaging directly with them.
A supplementary, Jackson Carlo.
The Deputy First Minister will know the particular interest of the Citizen Participation in Public Petitions Committee. We've taken extensive evidence over many years, in fact, from the Fornethy survivors. We've obviously received the Deputy First Minister's letter. We will still have an opportunity to consider it formally, but I can say that informally today, the committee is unanimously still of the view, as we expressed it, that these women are entitled to compensation. We are bitterly disappointed. So I should serve notice to the Deputy First Minister that the committee will seek debating time in the Chamber to give this Chamber the opportunity to express its view as to whether or not the Government should change its position.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I first of all commend the committee, the Petitions Committee, for the way in which they have taken evidence on this matter in a compassionate, caring but robust manner, which is totally in keeping with the weighty matters that are under discussion. I am obviously willing to engage with the committee as is appropriate, including engaging with Parliament if it comes to that. These are not matters that I have concluded lightly. I have engaged extensively with survivors that are involved with the redress scheme, as I know the convener will have as well. And to conclude, Presiding Officer, I will of course engage directly with the survivors in the coming days.
And supplementary, Colin Smith.
Presiding Officer, these were wee girls, hundreds, maybe even thousands, sent to Fornethy by the state, abused at the hands of the state, physically, mentally and in some cases sexually. Yet the state, this government, Glasgow City Council, are utterly failing to take any responsibility. So if the Deputy First Minister doesn't believe extending the redress scheme is the way for the state to take responsibility, then what does she think is the way? Now, when I and the Fornethy survivors meet with the Deputy First Minister next week, some of the women won't be there because they've died since they were abused. How much longer did these survivors have to wait?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I say up front in my answer that having read of some of the experiences, having listened carefully to the experiences that have been shared, I am in absolutely no doubt about the appalling and disgraceful and disgusting abuse that has been suffered by those individuals. And that is why it is so important that we get this right, that we navigate the issues, recognising the debate when this legislation was first passed, the views of survivors then, and I do look forward to meeting with Colin Smith and the survivors next week. But the decision that the government has come to does not in any way diminish the experiences suffered by those at Fornethy.
Question number 2, Willie Coffey.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with UK Government counterparts regarding future plans for the shared prosperity and levelling up funds.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, we're in regular contact with the UK Government on a range of issues, including the shared prosperity and levelling up funds. We continue to seek clarity on the future of those programmes, which I don't have as yet.
Willie Coffey.
Can I thank the Deputy First Minister for that answer? Let's remember, Presiding Officer, that these funds emerged as a replacement for European funding, for which we had full engagement with and scrutiny of. But with these, there was none of that, no attempt to even engage with our local councils on whether they shared the priorities set for them by the last UK Government. Is there any hope that the Labour Government will reverse that nonsense and refocus the policy intention of these funds so that what is ultimately delivered for local people reflects local needs and priorities, and that this Parliament will have a role in scrutinising the effectiveness of how this public money is spent?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I am encouraged by the Labour Party's manifesto commitment to restore decision-making over the allocation of structural funds to the devolved nations. And so, taking them at their word, I therefore expect to work with the UK Government in the design and implementation of any future funds and only await the invitation to do so.
Supplementary, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just say how much I welcome the newfound enthusiasm on the SNP benches for the shared prosperity and levelling up funds. I don't remember hearing that in the recent past, but it's good to know that they've been welcomed. I wonder if the Deputy First Minister would agree with me that many communities across Scotland benefited from these funds, and we all want to see them continue.
Deputy First Minister.
They used to benefit from all the funds that we got from the European Union as well, which I think they had more power over, control over and more say in the allocation of. So I think my newfound enthusiasm is in the hope that the decisions might be less politicised than they were under the regime operated by Murdo Fraser's colleagues.
Supplementary, Paul Swinney.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. There has been deep frustration in Glasgow in recent months due to the closure of Regeneration and Capital Grant Fund at a Scottish Government level, but also the suspension of funds like the Community Ownership Fund at UK Government level. So would the Deputy First Minister please look to engage rapidly with the Treasury and our colleagues in Government to ensure that when the budget is forthcoming in October, we can rapidly reopen those funds if capital funding is unlocked?
Deputy First Minister.
The member can rest assured that my colleague, the Finance Secretary, is engaging extensively with the UK Government in order to ensure that there is adequate capital in order to reopen those funds. Unfortunately, I think that we are not feeling overly optimistic considering the words of the Prime Minister about things getting worse before they get better and the Chancellor's comments that this may be the hardest budget. And therefore we will keep up our engagement, but it would be great if all members in this chamber also recognise the fact that if there is more capital at source, we can do more.
And supplementary, Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I recently met with STEP in my constituency who raised the issue of a lack of clarity on the future of the Shared Prosperity Fund and its impact on investment. Does the Deputy First Minister share these concerns?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I completely recognise the uncertainty that organisations such as STEP are facing regarding the future of the Shared Prosperity Fund. We need clarity from the UK Government on its plans so that organisations can indeed plan ahead. And my officials, with Shona Robison, will continue to press for more financial clarity.
Question number 3, Fergus Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions the Economic Secretary has had with ministerial colleagues regarding support for any businesses impacted by the ban on wood-burning stoves in new-build homes.
Minister Tom Arthur.
Presiding Officer, while the Economy Secretary has had no meetings with colleagues on the topic, I do want to make clear that there is no ban on wood-burning stoves. Under the new build heat standard, wood-burning stoves can continue to be installed as emergency heating in new buildings. However, we acknowledge that stoves are often installed for more frequent use, and we are currently undertaking a review of the standard. This has involved both official and ministerial engagement with stove industry stakeholders. The Minister for Climate Action is overseeing the review and will update Parliament when it reaches its conclusions shortly.
Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, as it happened some years ago, I purchased a wood stove from an excellent small business in Inverness, going by the name of Bonk and Co. That is Bonk and Co. Does the Minister agree with me that the failure to lift the ban on companies like Bonk and Co. selling their stoves for new homes is utterly, wait for it, bonkers, and also a hangover from the Green Deal, which, like the wood stove contents, should surely now be no more than smouldering ashes?
Minister.
Well, can I commend Fergus Ewing for assiduously representing local businesses in his constituencies, and I would suggest that for new members elected in 2026 who are looking for some instruction on how to represent businesses in their constituency, we have no finer example to turn to than Mr Ewing. The points he raises is why we are undertaking this review, and as I've said, the Minister for Climate Action is overseeing this work and is leading on it, and will of course report to Parliament in terms of providing an update. I, of course, as a Minister within the Economy portfolio, stand ready and willing to engage with any member of this Parliament on any concerns they may have with regards to how government regulation impacts upon business in their constituency.
On supplementary, Jamie Hawker-Johnson.
Thank you. In the consultation for its new Heat in Buildings Bill, the Scottish Government is proposing, and I quote, to introduce a new law which will require those purchasing a property to comply with a prohibition on polluting heating within a specified amount of time following the completion of the sale. I know Fergus Ewing's question related to the impact of the new build heat standard and the ban on wood burners in new build properties, but can the Minister assure me that his government isn't about to get itself into another mess trying to ban wood burners and other forms of direct heating from homes? And if it is, what analysis has it undertaken on the further economic impact this will have on businesses?
Minister.
Well, I would want to assure the member that with all legislation and all regulation, this government will be having the closest engagement with business and engaging in the closest analysis of all particular economic impacts that could arise locally or nationally. So I hope that provides some reassurance for the member, and I'd be more than happy to engage with him further if he wishes to discuss more.
Question number 4, Patrick Harvey.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it has taken to implement the policy announced in March 2022 in regard to companies maintaining trade links with Russia following the invasion of Ukraine.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, in March 2022, we called on businesses in Scotland to sever their links with Russia. That policy reflects the specific circumstances of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and is additional to the UK Government's regime of sanctions against Russia. We subsequently issued guidance for the Scottish Government and our economic agencies when entering into a significant relationship with companies. This sets out checks to undertake on companies to identify links with Russia and steps they have taken to withdraw from them, while recognising that severing links may not always be feasible in exceptional circumstances.
Patrick Harvey.
The Deputy First Minister may be aware of a Glasgow-based company, Seapeak, which has been the subject of reports by investigative journalists and which has continued to run vessels trading in Russian LNG. The fact that a firm based in Glasgow is continuing to prop up the Putin regime by trading in fossil fuels, regardless of either the invasion of Ukraine or the climate emergency, will shock and disgust many people. Yet there is currently no action being taken to shut down this extraordinarily unethical business. Will the Deputy First Minister write to the new Foreign Secretary highlighting this scandal and urging the UK Government to ensure that firms profiteering from a business that fuels climate change and helps fund Putin's illegal war are shut down?
Deputy First Minister.
Patrick Harvey suggests sanctions are a reserved matter, and we have made very clear what our views are in relation to Russia, and we expect businesses and organisations to reflect that are operating in Scotland. We have called on the UK Government to put in place the strongest possible sanctions regime against Russia, and I will indeed write to the Foreign Secretary to make clear our position on these matters and to encourage them to continue to increase pressure on the Russian regime.
Question number 5, Ruth Maguire.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what assessment it's made of the contribution that house building makes to the Scottish economy.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, our statistics estimate that in 2023 investment in dwellings, so that's both house building and repairs and maintenance, totalled around £6.9 billion, directly contributing 3.5% of GDP, and as set out in our long-term strategy, Housing to 2040, housing makes a crucial contribution to our vision of an economy that delivers sustainable and inclusive growth for the people of Scotland.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank the Deputy First Minister for that answer. As well as benefits to the wider economy, housing plays a critical role in the economic opportunity for individuals and their families. Impact quality housing has on health and education is also well understood. With that in mind, can I ask the Deputy First Minister to provide an update on the work of the Housing Investment Task Force and the actions being taken to unlock housing investment that will bring economic and social benefit to our communities?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I met with the Housing Minister just a matter of hours ago to discuss progress on the Housing Investment Task Force and to consider how we can work together to ensure that there is a flow of investment and homes are being built. We recognise that housing is one of the most pressing economic issues of our day, but it's also one of the biggest opportunities if we can support people to live in a warm, secure and affordable home. In the programme for government later today, Parliament will see the actions that we are taking that take account of some of the early outputs from the task force. The task force itself is due to report by the end of March 2025.
Supplementary, Miles Briggs.
You, Deputy Presiding Officer. During the summer, I met with a number of developers who have highlighted the total collapse now in the mid-market rent sector in Scotland following its inclusion in the SNP Green rent controls policy. I'm sorry to say that these developers are saying Scotland is not open for business, and we are seeing these developments and investments going to the north of England. So can I ask the Deputy First Minister if the Scottish Government will now agree to remove mid-market rent developments from the rent controls so that we can make sure these homes are actually built?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I just briefly set the context that since 2007 we've supported the delivery of more than 131,000 affordable homes, with more than 93,000 of those being for social rent, and we will continue to build on that record with almost £600 million of investment in the affordable housing supply programme this year. We are focused on delivering 110,000 affordable homes by 2032, and we have brought forward the review scheduled for 2026 to 2024 to concentrate on deliverability. I see an opportunity here to ensure that the regulatory framework allows us to deliver investment, to build homes and to ensure that everyone has access to secure and affordable housing. And we will work with investors as well as representatives of the housing market and, critically, tenants in order to get it right.
And supplementary, Carol Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. During the summer, I met with a number of workers within the house building industry, roofers, joiners and other trades workers. Young people and industry experts telling me the challenge they face finding training places, skilled workers and recruiting into industry. I met one young apprentice who required to travel to London to gain a qualification to allow him to work within his chosen trade, and this is not unusual. Given how important house building and indeed home improvement is to the Scottish economy, would the Deputy First Minister agree to encourage better cross-portfolio working to ensure the sector can bridge this gap in locally accessible training places? And would she consider meeting industry experts who do have some solutions to help with these skills gaps?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, in short, I am very happy to meet with, to work with businesses, organisations and workers that are helping to deliver our pipeline of housing. The skills that she references is relevant to housing, but is actually relevant to the wider construction industry. And we know how critical construction is to our overall economic performance, as well as to supporting some of the perhaps more deprived communities in Scotland, because through investment in infrastructure we can regenerate different parts of Scotland. So there is a big opportunity here, which is a long way of saying I'm very happy to work with them.
Question number 6, David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions it has had with Harland and Wolff regarding any potential job losses at its yards in Meffel in the Kirkcaldy constituency and Arnish on Isle of Uis.
Minister Tom Martin.
The Scottish Government has held regular discussions with the management team and unions at Harland and Wolff. The Deputy First Minister spoke to the Executive Chairman on Monday 2nd September, and I visited the Meffel site in July, when I was able to confirm our commitment to working with the company to secure the future for the vitally important jobs they provide at both sites.
David Torrance.
The workforce at both these Scottish yards are passionate, dedicated and highly skilled. In recent years, the Meffel site has seen a resurgence in shipbuilding. In addition, it has continued its presence in the renewable sector. Does the Cabinet Secretary share my view that every avenue must be explored to safeguard the future of the site and ensure that jobs and apprenticeship opportunities for future generations exist for many years to come?
Minister.
Yes, I do, and I can also assure David Torrance that the Scottish Government are engaging with the UK Government and the business, both at a senior and a local level. It is ultimately up to the management teams and investors within the business to work through the commercial options to provide a sustainable future for the organisation and the workforce. The business is fully aware of the interest from both governments, and the management are working closely with the UK and Scottish governments.
And supplementary, Claire Baker.
Thank you very much. As Mr Torrance has recognised, the site at Methil has a highly skilled and committed workforce, and they are keen to contribute towards a just transition. I understand that the Methil and Arnish sites have progressed to Phase 2 of the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council Strategic Investment Model. That's an important fund for supporting businesses who are going to help us realise a just transition. Can I ask when a decision on investment is going to be made, and does the Minister recognise the importance of a swift decision to protect jobs in Methil and support the yard to secure contracts?
Minister.
I'm not in a position to confirm when a decision will be made, but I do recognise the points that the member raises.
And question number 8, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the development of its green industrial strategy and its commitment to leverage up to £500 million over the next 5 years for Scotland's offshore wind supply chain.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, we will publish the green industrial strategy shortly. We're kick-starting our commitment to invest up to £500 million to anchor our offshore wind supply chain in Scotland, with investment of £67 million in the sector this financial year. That supports market certainty, creating highly productive, competitive offshore wind sector, providing thousands of new jobs, embedding innovation, boosting skills, and we're working across the public sector to ensure that funding is delivered to the projects as quickly as possible, subject to rigorous due diligence and value for money assurance processes.
Liam MacArthur.
I thank the Deputy First Minister. Last year, the Floating Offshore Wind Task Force made clear that a minimum of 3 to 5 Scottish ports need to urgently be transformed into new industrial hubs to enable the required rollout of floating offshore wind. Without major downstream infrastructure investment in our offshore wind sector, there's little prospect of Scotland meeting our net zero goals or realising our energy potential. So, given the Finance Secretary's confirmation yesterday that ScotWind revenues will be diverted away from tackling the climate and biodiversity crises, can the Deputy First Minister provide a cast-iron assurance that the Government remains committed to that £500 million leveraging in over the next 5 years for the offshore wind sector, alongside a 10-year £500 million Just Transition Fund?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I think the fact that we have already spent £67 million as part of that £500 million illustrates that we are serious about delivering this investment. We're taking a commercial-first approach to investment to leverage private funding in the infrastructure and manufacturing facilities critical to our world-leading offshore wind sector. And while investments are likely to have a specific geographical focus, perhaps even on Orkney, the wider economic value will benefit all of Scotland in the process.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. That concludes portfolio questions on Deputy First Minister responsibilities, economy and Gaelic. And there will be a very short pause before we move on to the next portfolio to allow members to change positions should they so wish. And if they could do that quickly, that would be helpful. Thank you. The next portfolio is Finance and Local Government. And again, if a member wishes to request a supplementary, they should do so by pressing the Request to Speak button during the relevant question. Question number 1, I call Claire Adamson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it last met with North Lanarkshire Council and what was discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Shona Robson.
Scottish ministers and Scottish Government officials regularly meet representatives from all local authorities to discuss a range of issues of mutual interest.
Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Primary 1 to 5 pupils receive free school meals thanks to the Scottish Government investment. Labour North Lanarkshire reportedly charges one of the highest prices for school meals in the country for primary 6 and 7 pupils. And we know the extent of in-work poverty in that area. A family in my Motherwell-Wishaw constituency could be paying £170 a month or £1,615 a year. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what action can be taken to ensure that my constituents are able to access affordable school meals amidst rising bills? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Scottish Government has made clear its commitment to supporting families and eradicating child poverty. We do have the most extensive provision of free school meals in the UK, and our free school meals programme is a key element to meeting these aims, and we continue to expand our programme with the next phase to families in receipt of Scottish Child Payment in primaries 6 and 7. I would just note and say to Claire Adamson that North Lanarkshire Council does have general fund reserves of £250 million as of the 31st of March 2023, the latest available audited figures, and I think that has increased in the provisional outturn figures. So, general fund reserves do need to be taken into account in terms of the decisions that local authorities make.
And supplementary, Gillian Mackay.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer. North Lanarkshire Council have recently increased the distance at which secondary school pupils are eligible for school buses, with the rollout to primary schools proposed for next year. Many parents are concerned about the proposed walking routes heading into winter, with many poorly lit. The alternative given to parents was the public service buses, and my office have received several stories of these buses driving past groups of school children or being too crowded to allow any more on. The local authority are citing budget issues as one of the reasons for cutting the routes. Will the Cabinet Secretary meet with me to find a solution to ensure that financial decisions are not being put ahead of the well-being of children in North Lanarkshire?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, I would be more than happy to meet with Gillian Mackay. Obviously, the decisions that local authorities make are for them to make. But I would say, further to the information I gave to Claire Adamson about reserves, the general fund reserves per head of population, I think North Lanarkshire has now risen to the 4th highest at 31st of March of this year, with a provisional outturn of £747 per person in terms of the reserve position. As I said earlier, the position of reserves needs to be seen as part of each local authority's budget setting and decisions that they make around the priorities that they have locally.
Question number 2, Liam Kerr.
Sir, to ask the Scottish Government how much funding it has allocated to local authorities whose housing stock and former housing stock requires demolition and rebuilding due to the presence of reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete.
Minister Ivan McKee.
It is the responsibility of building owners to maintain their properties and for each local authority to decide the appropriate action in relation to RAC identified, which primarily is a building maintenance concern. Although there is no new funding available to address this issue, where the local authority has decided that demolition is the best solution, we will work with them to explore flexibilities within current funding for them to consider. Local authorities manage their own budgets, but we are committed to working alongside them on this to ensure that they and any homeowners affected are supported appropriately.
Liam Kerr.
Well, underfunded Aberdeen City Council is pressing ahead with knocking down homes in Torrybalnagasket at a cost of £25 million. Reports suggest rebuilding could cost £130 million and take up to 15 years. And all the while, displaced residents who report this is causing them anxiety and despair just don't believe their homes will ever be rebuilt. Now, last week, the Scottish Government informed the Petitions Committee that affected households will see engagement in the coming weeks and months. So what has the Minister actually done to ensure Aberdeen City Council will have sufficient funds to rebuild and can do so sooner than 15 years?
Minister.
Well, I think the first point to note is that Aberdeen City Council have had an increase of an additional 5.4% on their budget, an extra £23.8 million to support day-to-day services. And it's also important to recognise that the previous UK government, the Conservative government, said that they would spend whatever it took to resolve the RAC issue, including funds coming to Scotland. And of course, they did not deliver on any of that, which means that we are in the position that we find ourselves at the moment. But of course, I've said we are very keen to work with any council that finds itself in this position to explore what possibilities there are to work together to resolve this very serious issue for the homeowners concerned and to support the council to deliver on that.
I have in fact received requests from 4 members. I would hope to take each of the 4, but I would need cooperation to have brief questions. First supplementary, Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have engaged with well over 100 constituents affected by RAC during what is one of the biggest housing crises Scotland has ever faced. And as council tenants move home, private homeowners, many with mortgages, face continued uncertainty. And regrettably, my repeated correspondence to the new UK Government on funding has gone unanswered. The decision made by Aberdeen City Council to demolish and rebuild limits private homeowners' choices on how to proceed. Therefore, what options does the Scottish Government have to afford the Council the fiscal flexibilities to offer just and equitable funding support to affected homeowners?
Minister.
My ministerial colleague, the Minister for Housing, and his officials have held constructive discussions with Aberdeen City Council throughout their options appraisal process for homes impacted by poor condition RAC. And as indicated in my earlier response to Mr Kerr, while there are no additional funds to allocate to this issue, we have supported the exploration of financial flexibility options for the Council to consider. Aberdeen City Council have not yet made a formal request for statutory flexibilities, but as soon as we receive this, we will give urgent consideration so that the Council may provide early assurance to those affected.
Supplementary, Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's good to hear that the Scottish Government are committed to resolving some of the issues around RAC. We have seen the publication of the Grenfell report today, and we are 7 years on, and there only have been 2 buildings remediated since that tragic fire. Can I ask the Minister how long he expects residents affected by RAC to have to wait, and if he'd make a commitment that it would be less time than the 7 years that many residents affected by combustible cladding have had to wait?
Minister.
As I've indicated, we are working with my colleague, the Minister for Housing, whose portfolio this is working with local authorities across Scotland to understand the extent of this and to work with them where they come forward and make formal requests for flexibilities to be able to ensure that together we're able to support householders that are affected by RAC. And I'm sure that my colleague, the Minister for Housing, will give an update in due course as to progress being made on this very important issue.
Supplementary, Mark Roscoe.
A group of residents in Tillicoultry were forced to move out of their homes over a year ago because of deteriorating RAC, but they still don't have access to their homes to collect personal belongings such as passports, and there are growing fears in the community these properties are going to be broken into. Can I ask the Minister what guidance the Scottish Government is offering councils on residents who may need to re-enter their homes to retrieve essential items during the period where they are unable to live there?
Minister.
I recognise the issue that the member raises, and I know that this has happened in other situations where residents have had to move out very quickly of their premises, and I've seen it in Glasgow as well, of course, at short notice due to safety concerns. Clearly there's a balance to be struck here between the safety of those residents who may want to enter those potentially very dangerous properties and their need to retrieve personal possessions and other important documents and so on. I will check with my ministerial colleagues what guidance there is available on this and respond to the member to make sure that he's aware of the current situation and the guidance that government has put in place to deal with those particular situations.
And supplementary, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This concrete isn't just in domestic dwellings, it is in public buildings as well. It's in hospitals, schools, libraries. It's now 18 months since I first brought this crisis to the attention of the government in this chamber, and we're just concluding the identification stage. So is the government now confident it knows where this concrete is in every building in the public estate? And secondly, is it going to extend capital funding to organisations like NHS Scotland to make sure that our patients are safe in the hospitals where they are?
Minister.
Well, clearly the requirement for funding will be part of ongoing budget discussions with my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, at the appropriate time once we're aware of the impact of RAC. But as the member will be aware, surveys have been undertaken across the public estate to assess the prevalence of RAC, but also as part of that, not just whether RAC exists, but the condition of that RAC and whether the criticality of the structural issues round about that. And with that information, we're proceeding to address that issue across the public estate.
Question number 3, Michael Mara.
To ask the Scottish Government, in line with the agreed procedure, whether it will provide the Scottish Fiscal Commission with a public sector pay policy ahead of its budget for 2025-26.
Cabinet Secretary.
There is an established protocol between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Fiscal Commission which sets out the information sharing expected to take place in the lead-up to the Scottish Budget. We will continue to engage and work collaboratively with the Commission on matters relating to public sector pay and workforce, and will strive to provide timely information related to pay in the lead-up to future fiscal events.
Michael Mara.
Well, I'd be very glad if the Finance Secretary would actually honour the protocol that was set out in October 2022. For the last 2 years, she has failed to do so. She told me in committee on 16th of January that it would not be right, I quote, to provide that policy. She may well noted the chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission in front of committee yesterday saying that this policy should be provided. Given the debacle of her cuts yesterday due to the incompetence partly around public sector pay, can she commit now to producing that policy to the Commission ahead of the budget?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, in the letter to Michael Mara on the 15th of January, the reason that I said we would have to wait to set out public sector pay policy was that there was going to be a UK spring budget following the budget in the autumn, which would provide an update on the fiscal outlook and on the UK Government's public spending policy that could impact on devolved funding envelopes. So the problem here for Michael Mara is the exact problem that Daniel Johnson, who I've got a lot of respect for, but got himself tied up in knots on Good Morning Scotland this morning when he tried to distinguish the impact of Tory cuts in Wales and the impact on the Welsh Labour Government having to bring forward an emergency budget, and as distinct from having no fault whatsoever when it comes to Scotland. So the Tories at fault when it comes to Wales, the Tories not at fault when it comes to Scottish public finances. It was excruciating to listen to, and Labour really have to come clean in their analysis of the situation. So we will continue to work with the Scottish Fiscal Commission. We will continue to make sure that pay policy is affordable, sustainable, and we will take that forward.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Supplementary, Elizabeth.
Cabinet Secretary, Professor Roy did say yesterday that this lack of information is a very serious matter. Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that when it comes to parliamentary scrutiny, it would be far preferable if we did have that information to hand?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can say to Liz Smith, absolutely, but I'm sure Liz Smith will also recognise that when you have a spring budget emerging straight after the budget we've just set, and then not knowing what the funding envelope is going to be for pay, then of course I needed to wait to see what that funding envelope was going to be. And of course that is absolutely critical. We can only set a pay policy that we can afford, and I have set out in great detail as to why the pay policy was set as it was, and of course, as I said at the time, anything beyond the pay policy would need to either be funded by more UK government funding or through cuts. That is the simple reality of the situation. So we will continue to work with SFC, we'll continue to work with the Finance Committee, but let's be absolutely clear that the Scottish Government's finances will be dictated in large part by what comes at the budget on the 30th of October.
Question number 4, Roger Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the recently published government expenditure and revenue figures, which reportedly show a £2,400 dividend in the last year for every person in Scotland as a result of its continued membership of the United Kingdom.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, firstly, we know that 90% of the GERS deficit is due to UK government choices. Secondly, we know that the UK government retains control of 40% of expenditure and over 70% of revenues in Scotland. That is set out in the GERS report. As an example, a significant portion of the spending allocated to Scotland relates to servicing UK government debt, which is paid at a higher rate than our European neighbours. So the Scottish Government is required to balance its budget each year and does so, and has always presented a balanced budget to Parliament. And in doing so, the Scottish Government has taken difficult decisions on revenue and expenditure in order to target the support to those in the greatest need, such as the Scottish Child Payment.
Roger Fraser.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for her response. Yesterday, when she was announcing the savage cuts she's making to public spending across Scotland thanks to SNP financial mismanagement, she incredibly claimed that separation would make things better. Given that our own government's figures show the complete opposite, that there would be a massive fiscal deficit of nearly £23 billion, how could she do that with a straight face?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as the Treasury have just pointed out in the last few weeks, the Treasury, which I am assuming Murdo Fraser will accept this figure, the deficit is on UK governments, his government, the Tory government, not resetting budgets due to inflationary pressures. That took £15 billion out of public funding, £15 billion. So we'll take no lectures from the Tories about financial management when they took £15 billion out of public services by not resetting budget with inflation, and of course £22 billion of a black hole, which of course the Labour Chancellor has outlined, which of course will impact on Scotland if the Labour government continues to follow Tory fiscal rules. And of course they're quite chummy today, so I'm sure unfortunately that's what Scotland will experience going forward.
Question number 5, Maurice Golding.
To ask the Scottish Government how it intends to fund pay increases for local government employees.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government has taken extraordinary decisions to provide £77.5 million to support a fair pay offer for local government workers. This is a better offer than made in the rest of the UK, and most will see a rise of more than 4%. This is at the absolute limit of affordability, and as set out to Parliament yesterday, we are taking action across all portfolios to balance our budget, and this is made more difficult by the Chancellor's decision not to fully fund pay deals and a lack of clarity on funding ahead of the UK Government's budget.
Maurice Golden.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Last week we learned the SNP were diverting £5 million from nature restoration to fund pay awards. Earlier this week, Unison members voted to reject the latest offer from COSLA. Given the Cabinet Secretary has also now slashed £23.4 million from the Net Zero and Energy budget, will she rule out diverting any more funds from climate and nature projects?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, we didn't want to have to make any of the decisions that we've had to make, but in order to resolve some of the pay disputes and to support public pay expenditure on pay, then we've had to take some of these very difficult decisions. Of course, the nature restoration budget that Maurice Golden referred to will be restored in 25-26. We made that commitment. But of course, I'm sure Maurice Golden will want to welcome the fact that the GMB, of course, have accepted the pay deal. We'll hear what Unite have to say tomorrow. The EIS have accepted the position for teachers, which again is something to be welcomed. We would urge COSLA to continue to discuss with Unison the position that they have, because they are, at the end of the day, the employers, and we would urge them to do so. What we don't want to see is further damaging industrial action, and that is why we have gone above and beyond in order to help with the envelope that COSLA could offer to local government workforce. It is also worth bearing in mind, Presiding Officer, that there is no additional funding coming from the UK Government for the local government workforce apart from teachers, and that is regrettable.
Thank you, Brief supplementary, David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary, like me, welcoming GMB members, have agreed overwhelmingly to support fair pay offer made, and does she share my disappointment that Unison members had voted to reject it? Hopefully Unite members will vote to accept it and agreement can be reached with Unison. Can she advise how the pay offer and levels for Scottish local government employees compare with other parts of the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I am pleased that over three-quarters of GMB Scotland members agreed that this is a fair pay offer and voted to accept it. The pay award offered in Scotland is, as I said earlier, better than that made to local government workers across the rest of the UK. More than 60% of workers would receive an increase of more than 4%, and importantly, the lowest paid workers, including Unison members, would receive an increase of 5.63%. I think that is a fair offer for all, and the Scottish Government will continue to work constructively with COSLA as efforts continue to secure a deal and avert industrial action, which, as I said, is in no one's interest.
Question number 6 is not lodged. Question number 7, Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions the Finance Secretary has had with the UK Government regarding public spending in light of the Prime Minister's remarks that the Labour administration's first budget is going to be painful.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the First Minister and I met the Chancellor of the Exchequer last week, and we discussed collaboration between the Scottish and UK governments, but also pressed the Chancellor on the need for public investment across the UK to protect public services, to tackle poverty and to grow the economy. The Prime Minister's remarks about the next UK budget, are deeply concerning, as this, as I said earlier, will absolutely directly impact on our funding. I set out yesterday the difficult decisions we are already taking on the challenges facing the Scottish budget, and as the Chancellor looks to her first budget, it is vital that public services and vulnerable people are protected and that we don't have further austerity impacting on public services here in Scotland.
Colette Stevenson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. After 14 years of Tory austerity, the Labour Party in Westminster is intensifying the worst of what we saw under the likes of David Cameron and Boris Johnson. My apologies. So, Labour's pledge to keep Tory fiscal rules is a huge factor in the £22 billion of cuts they are now choosing to make. Labour promised change, but they are delivering the same old failed Westminster economic agenda. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that the UK Labour government must see sense, invest in public services, reverse the cuts to Scotland's capital budget,
Thank you, Ms Stevenson. Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Colette Stevenson for her question? So the Chancellor absolutely has a choice to make in her forthcoming budget. She can continue with Tory fiscal rules and Tory austerity, or she can change course and invest in public services. Increased funding for infrastructure and public services will be absolutely required if we want to take the action to lift children out of poverty, including, of course, things that the Labour Chancellor could also do to help that, like ending the damaging two-child limit. So there is a political choice here, and Labour in this Parliament cannot escape the reality that Labour austerity looks and feels to public services exactly the same as Tory austerity does. It is a political choice, and they will be held to account for whatever choice they make.
And question number 8, Ariane Burgess.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of its reported decisions to instruct local authorities to divert money from the Nature Restoration Fund towards local government pay settlements, what discussions the Finance Secretary has had with ministerial colleagues regarding action that can be taken to mitigate any impact of this decision on projects aimed at reversing nature loss?
Cabinet Secretary.
So within an extremely challenging financial context, the Scottish Government has made difficult decisions in order to deliver fair pay deals and to avoid industrial action across the public sector. Protecting and restoring our natural environment is key to addressing the twin crises of nature loss and climate change. More than £50 million has already been distributed through the Nature Restoration Fund since 2021. And while capital funding of £5 million from this year's Nature Restoration Fund has been redirected within local authorities to fund the pay offer, as I said earlier, it has been agreed between ministers that it will be replaced in 2025-26.
Ariane Burgess.
The Nature Restoration Fund has created jobs right across Scotland and brought benefits to local communities, their economies and environments. The Greens are fully in favour of fair deals for council workers. But instead of dipping into funding that benefits communities, the Scottish Government could cut back on subsidies and tax cuts to big businesses like Shell, Ineos and Acorn Partners, who continue to receive millions in public funds whilst raking in record profits for climate-wrecking fossil fuels. Will the Scottish Government reconsider, retain nature funding and accelerate reform of Scotland's outdated council funding so councils can deliver for nature and for workers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, on that last point, can I say to Ariane Burgess that we do want to make progress on council funding and the way that local taxation works, and I chair the joint group with COSLA that is aiming to do just that, and the progress has been made around things like second homes and empty homes. But the point about the Fair Pay Deal and the Nature Restoration Fund is that it had to be funding that was available now in year. So the ideas and issues that Ariane Burgess raised would not release that funding in year to be able to support the pay deal in the here and now, and that had to be done. So these choices are difficult, but they were the only ones available in order to make that pay envelope bigger to be able to make that offer. So as I say, that money will be restored in 25-26 because we do recognise the importance of that, and I hope that's something that Ariane Burgess will support.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the portfolio questions on finance and the whole government. There will be a very short pause before we move on to the next item of business. Thank you.
The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on Programme for Government 2024 to 2025. The statement will then be debated, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on John Swinney, up to 30 minutes, First Minister.
Presiding Officer, this year Parliament marks the 25th anniversary of its opening, and I have witnessed every previous programme for government being announced, albeit from different places across the parliamentary chamber. Today, however, is the first time that I present a programme for government. It is an extraordinary privilege to do so and to have the opportunity to further shape the direction of our country. I do so in a spirit that recognises that we all come from different political traditions. I believe that Scotland would best be able to progress as an independent country, where the issues we address in this programme can be more effectively resolved. Others take the opposite view. We have a range of priorities and perspectives, but fundamentally we are all here to contribute to creating the best future we can for Scotland. My government does not command a majority in this Parliament. We have to work with others to make progress on our agenda. I therefore set out this programme for government with a commitment to work across this chamber to seek common ground with others. I extend the invitation to colleagues to work together to find that common ground. A quarter of a century after its creation, this Parliament faces some of its toughest tests. We're all aware of the problems and difficulties that have been caused by 14 years of austerity driven by the United Kingdom Government. We're all aware of the acute challenges that are faced due to the impact of sky-high inflation and the failure of the United Kingdom Government to adequately address increases in the budget to deal with that fact. We know that because we can all see the pressure on our public services, and also because the Chancellor of the Exchequer has made that very point clear to the House of Commons. The Scottish Government has set out to Parliament the difficult decisions we have to take to address those circumstances. Today I set out how, within that challenging situation, my government will deliver for the people of Scotland. This programme for government sets out simply and clearly our intentions for the next 12 months. Its purpose is to ensure that government spends every day delivering for the people of Scotland. The commitments in it are practical, not partisan. They are affordable, impactful and deliverable. Together, they reflect my optimism that even though we face an incredibly challenging set of circumstances at this moment, the inherent strengths of Scotland, our people and our communities, can create great possibilities for our country. When I became the First Minister, I made clear that my government would focus on 4 priorities: eradicating child poverty, building prosperity, improving our public services and protecting the planet. Child poverty is first and foremost in these priorities. No child should have their opportunities, their development, their health and well-being and their future curtailed by the material wealth of their family. Not ever, and certainly not today in a modern, prosperous society like Scotland. This is not only the moral compass of my government, it is the greatest investment in our country's future that we can possibly make. It is the route to enabling greater participation in our economy and our society. It is the route to enabling more people to fulfil their potential and to be contributors to our country. We have dedicated roughly £3 billion a year to eradicating poverty and mitigating the impacts of the cost of living crisis. We have established and increased our widely praised Scottish Child Payment, expanded funded early learning and childcare, and committed around £1.2 billion to mitigate the impacts of 14 years of UK welfare policy. These measures, which are key to increasing family incomes and enabling those greater levels of participation in our economy, are central to our programme for government. The Child Poverty Action Group estimates that low-income families in Scotland will be around £28,000 better off by the time their child turns 18 compared to families across the UK. And analysis by the Scottish Government estimates that around 100,000 children will be kept out of relative poverty this year. These achievements are significant and show the difference that we are making. But our goal is not just to keep some children out of poverty or only to make child poverty less acute. Our goal is to lift every child in Scotland who is in poverty out of it, so we must do more. We know that we cannot address child poverty without addressing family poverty. We know that families thrive when they are supported by coordinated, holistic services that meet their needs and are easy to access. Many amazing and dedicated practitioners are already working tirelessly to connect services and adapt them to the needs of the families that they support. We must create a system of whole family support that is available across the country. We must ensure this system is easy to access, well connected and responsive to families' needs. Over the coming year, we will work with partners to enable greater local flexibility so that services can be more easily tailored to the needs of the families that they support. We will look at what budgets can be pooled and what reporting can be streamlined. This will involve working closely with our local authority partners, other public services and the third sector to align services and ensure there is a focus across our public services on meeting the needs and supporting the resilience of families. We will consider where greater investment is needed, and we will use the learning of what is already working from our pilot areas. Some of that evidence comes from, for example, the Early Adopter Community Project in Dundee. In that project, key workers have been engaging with members of the public who face obstacles to entering the labour market. By providing focused childcare support, advice on eligibility for benefit provision and employability support, individuals are being supported into the labour market. These individuals are sustaining employment and experiencing a number of benefits to their financial and mental well-being. The key objective of the approach that we will take will be to deliver significant reform of the work of public services to deliver whole family support extensively across the country. This will create the conditions that support more parents into employment and reinforce our work to eradicate child poverty. Key to the work on whole family support will be a focus on prevention and early intervention, those small supports early on that can pay big dividends down the line. This includes pregnancy and the first years of a child's life. Addressing risks and problems at this stage can have positive impacts that last through to adulthood. It can support healthy development, prevent illness and ease future pressure on services, making the entire system more sustainable. So in the coming year, we will ensure that more women get to know and receive care and support from the same midwifery team from pregnancy through birth. We'll invest nearly £1 billion a year in affordable, high-quality and funded early learning and childcare, and we commit to supporting early development and reducing development concerns at 27 to 30 months by a quarter by 2030. We will support schools to reduce the poverty-related attainment gap across every local authority area each year between now and 2026. And we will ensure that when young people are ready to enter the workplace, they have the learning, the skills and the opportunities to succeed. We will invest in community-based youth work and improve career support so that there is better information on career choices. For those households struggling now, boosting financial security and cutting costs is one of the most direct things that we can do to support them out of poverty. So we will expand advice in accessible settings, including community centres and hospitals. This will expand a programme that in its first year helped over 5,500 people access financial gains of over £7.5 million to support their families. We will also complete the national rollout of our carer support payment, which will support over 100,000 carers this financial year, including for the first time ever some in full-time education. The effect of this provision will be to enable much greater participation in education for those with caring responsibilities, which will greatly increase the opportunities for those individuals to make an economic contribution to our society. That effort to stimulate greater economic participation lies at the heart of the measures in this programme for government. A key aspect also of our programme to support families is to ensure that we take effective action to enable people to have a safe and secure place to call their home. The tragic Grenfell Tower fire emphasised how important building and fire safety is. Keeping residents and homeowners safe is our priority, and we are taking action to protect lives by ensuring the assessment and remediation of buildings with potentially unsafe cladding is carried out. We will also carefully consider all of the recommendations in the Grenfell Tower Inquiry's report. This year, we will invest nearly £600 million in affordable housing, including an additional £40 million to bring existing homes into affordable use. There will be a strong focus on working with partners to enable existing accommodation that is not currently in use to be made available as swiftly as possible to meet the need for housing, ensuring we take every step we can to boost the availability of housing as quickly as we possibly can. We will provide a further £100 million to support the construction of around 2,800 mid-market rent homes. And in progressing our proposals for rent controls, we will introduce amendments at stage 2 of the Housing Bill to ensure that tenants have the protection they need and that Scotland is able to attract more investment to supplement the investment we are making through the public finances. These commitments are central to our efforts to tackle poverty, but they are also inextricably linked to our efforts to increase national prosperity with a strong, green, well-being economy. It takes thriving businesses, large and small, to sustain our families and our communities. We are already making significant progress in this area. Since 2007, GDP per person in Scotland has grown by 11% compared to the UK's 6%. Productivity has grown at an average rate more than double that of the United Kingdom, and last year earnings in Scotland grew more quickly than in any other part of the United Kingdom. This includes London and the South East. But again, we must go further. It is not enough to simply have a strong economy. True prosperity goes beyond pounds and pence. It means an economy that is inclusive, that supports people into work, attracts investment, promotes entrepreneurs and innovators, and furthers our work on our path to net zero. Key to this will be increasing the levels of infrastructure investment and creating the right conditions for business investment. For the past 9 years, we've been the UK's top destination out of London for foreign direct investment. This government will be focused on delivering investment-friendly policies and support, such as the Scottish National Investment Bank, which will help to build on the strong performance we have built to date. Last year, the bank supported 1,850 jobs by investing in companies with over £92 million of supply chain spend in Scotland. Its £60 million investment in Thriving Investments Mid-Market Rent Fund will help deliver affordable, quality rental homes. Put simply, this means tenants benefiting from the scheme will pay lower rents, but the economy will be boosted by the development activity involved. To ensure Scotland remains a premier location for investment, we will align government and public bodies behind a coordinated programme to attract investment in priority areas such as net zero, housing and infrastructure. We will build on recent successes, such as the Sumitomo and Ardésir projects, to promote our national project pipeline of investment opportunities. We will develop 2 green freeports and establish 2 new investment zones. And with our commitment of up to £500 million of investment, we will seek to generate at least £1.5 billion in private investment to support the offshore wind sector. A critical element of ensuring that Scotland is attractive to investors means that we must intensify our support to Scotland's innovators and entrepreneurs as part of our work to become a start-up and scale-up nation. So this year we will maximise the impact of our national network of start-up support, our Tech Scaler programme. The programme has already supported start-ups to raise £70 million in investment. We will also work with organisations like Scottish Enterprise, the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland and the National Robotarium to create new opportunities for our most promising deep tech companies. We will ensure our universities can contribute to international leading research and economic growth and support the development of business clusters in areas such as digital and AI, life sciences and the energy transition. Small and medium-sized businesses are the backbone of our economy, so we will deliver the commitments set out in the New Deal for Business. And we will empower decision-making through regional economic partnerships and sign the Falkirk and Grangemouth and Argyll and Bute regional growth deals. We will tackle economic inactivity and skill shortages in our workforce and remove barriers to employment. This includes leading a new national approach to skills planning and introducing the Post-School Education Reform Bill to simplify the post-school funding body landscape. Special support for disabled people will be enhanced across all local authorities by the summer of 2025. We will expand Scotland's migration service and continue to make the case for tailored migration routes, including a rural visa pilot to support rural employers to recruit the people that they need. We will support Scotland's culture sector and creative industries, which are key to our economy, our culture and national identity, and we recognise the need for the artistic and creative community to be well supported for the future. A review of Creative Scotland will be undertaken to ensure the appropriate approach is in place to meet the needs of the sector, and I am pleased to confirm to Parliament that the resources required to enable Creative Scotland to continue the work of the Open Fund are now available for them to distribute. And we will continue to invest in our national infrastructure, the transport and digital networks that enable our economy to thrive. This year, over 20,000 premises will be connected to gigabit-capable broadband across Scotland in areas of market failure. We will progress the dualling of the A9, with construction expected to start before the end of this year on the Tomatin to Moy stretch, and the procurement process is already underway on the Tay Crossing to Ballinluig stretch. We will deliver 3 of the 6 new major ferries under construction at the present time, and we will progress the procurement of 7 new electric ferries as part of the small vessel programme. We will also continue to invest in our rail network and upgrade and reconfigure power supplies to support further electrification of our railways. All of this will improve access to and from our rural and island communities, improving transportation safety, journey times and reliability, and generate economic growth. It will also enable delivery of our valuable public services and ensure people in every corner of Scotland have access to the high-quality services they need when they need them. Public services touch every aspect of our day-to-day lives. They support our families, they enable our economy to grow and to thrive. Key to public services is ensuring everyone has access to high-quality services that are right for them. Those services must be easy to access and to navigate. Nowhere is this more notable than with our National Health Service. We've seen terrific successes in our National Health Service, including the best-performing core A&E departments anywhere in the United Kingdom. We need to ensure our NHS has the resources it needs both for today and for the years to come. We will increase boards' baseline funding to reduce waiting list backlogs. We will deliver around 20,000 more orthopaedic, ophthalmology and general surgery procedures annually in our new national treatment centres, and free up 210,000 planned care outpatient appointments through our Centre for Sustainability delivery programmes, thus eliminating unnecessary hospital attendances. We will also reform primary care, increasing capacity and access to general practice, community pharmacy, dental and community eye care services by the end of 2026. And backed by £120 million of additional funding for NHS boards, we will support continued improvements across a range of mental health services and treatments. This includes meeting the child and adolescent mental health services waiting time standard nationally and clearing backlogs by December 2025. We will intensify our work to tackle delayed discharge. No one should remain in hospital any longer than they need to, so we will standardise best practice and an integrated approach from the time a person enters hospital through to their timely discharge. This will ensure everyone can recover in the best, least intensive setting for them, whilst also making room in hospital for those who need it. But in this challenging fiscal environment, we cannot deliver public services as we did in years past. We must change the model of service delivery to promote positive outcomes, prioritise prevention and reduce demand for future services. Once again, intelligent investment and innovation will be key here. For example, the Scottish Government invested £4 million to pilot rapid cancer diagnostic services across 5 NHS boards. This service works through primary care to provide a quicker diagnosis to people experiencing non-specific symptoms. Impressively, an evaluation of the pilot in NHS Fife and in NHS Dumfries and Galloway found the estimated time to diagnosis was roughly 65 days faster than via the more usual route of a general surgery clinic. Earlier diagnosis means better outcomes, less intensive treatment and less strain on the system. It means Scotland as a whole is healthier. We have similar ambitions for all of our public services as part of our 10-year public service reform programme, which will guide our approach. And every area of this government is committed to delivering reform consistent with those principles. As part of this ambitious programme, we will work with local authorities to boost school standards with a focus on attendance, behaviour and the curriculum. We will implement the curriculum improvement cycle and progress with qualifications reform. And we will reform our national education bodies to drive improvement, raise standards and ensure that the needs of learners are always at the forefront of our work. We attach the greatest significance to the safety of our communities, so we will work with Police Scotland to ensure that that remains the case. And because our public services are only as strong as the people who deliver them, we will continue to award fair pay settlements, reduce workloads and improve conditions for our public service employees. We will review and reform the junior doctor and dentist contract, progress towards the 36-hour working week for Agenda for Change staff, and provide local authorities with £145 million to protect teacher numbers. But every one of these important actions, and indeed everything I have mentioned so far, will be rendered ineffective if we do not also address the greatest existential threat of our times. We must take effective action to tackle the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. It is absolutely essential that we protect our planet by reducing emissions, restoring our natural environment and investing in adaptations that will protect us from the impacts of climate change. While we are decarbonising at a faster rate than the rest of the UK, the most difficult part of the journey lies ahead. The world's global temperature has now pushed past the internationally agreed 1.5 degrees Celsius. 10 of our hottest years have come in the last 20, and the increased frequency of storms and floods is already having a real impact on communities and key sectors. In addition to this, the 2023 State of Nature in Scotland report found that monitored species have declined by 15% over the last 30 years. We are already making real progress protecting our environment and helping it to recover. 75% of all new UK woodlands are here in Scotland. But we must adapt to the changes in our environment. That is why we will take forward our National Adaptation Plan. We will work with Scottish Water to improve the resilience of our water and sewage systems to intense rainfall and drought. And we will restore at least 10,000 hectares of degraded peatland and create at least 10,000 acres of woodlands. We will also bring forward a natural environment bill to support delivery of our net zero and biodiversity goals. Climate change legislation that will enable 5-year carbon budgets to be set and delivered will be introduced. This, along with our climate change plan and our sectoral just transition plans, will chart the course to net zero by 2045. Tackling the climate emergency is not only a danger that must be recognised and managed, it is an imperative that should motivate us to change. Scotland is a land of remarkable innovation and abundant natural resources. We can tackle climate change whilst at the same time growing our economy. Indeed, we have been doing it for decades. Between 1990 and 2022, Scotland's economy grew by 67% in real terms. In that same time, we cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half. And last year, the Scottish National Investment Bank, in the course of investing in businesses and projects that support our economy, also avoided, reduced or removed over 52,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent across its portfolio. In 2022, renewable technologies generated the equivalent of 113% of Scotland's overall electricity consumption. In 2024, our capacity for renewable energy generation increased to 15.4 gigawatts, and with the projects currently in the planning pipeline, we have the potential to produce more than 3 times that. We will shortly publish our energy strategy and just transition plan. By delivering the commitments within it, we will again double our ambitions for renewable energy generation. As part of this, we are acting to speed up the planning and consenting regime for renewable energy generation to provide certainty to the market and to stimulate private investment. We will invest £9 million to support Scotland's manufacturing industries to invest in energy efficiency and decarbonisation projects. And we will work with the UK Government to deliver the infrastructure required for a net zero emissions energy system, including by providing £2 million as part of the promised support for carbon capture of up to £80 million to support the Acon carbon transport and storage project and securing a positive future for Grangemouth. We need to take forward careful stewardship of our oil and gas sector to ensure a sector that contributes significantly to the economic health of Scotland at this moment is able to make the transition effectively to net zero. The expertise of the sector will be vital both to the future of the industry and our transition to net zero. We need to keep those skills in Scotland as we move towards a green economy, for we are in the midst of a renewables revolution here in Scotland. Alongside our investment in renewables, we will support households and communities to reduce emissions. More than a third of the population already benefit from our offer of free bus travel. We have some of the most generous grants and loans in the UK to support the move to clean heating, and we are within reach of 6,000 electric vehicle charging points in 2024, 2 years ahead of schedule. This year we will conclude the review of our new build heat standard and bring forward a heat in buildings bill. The bill will set a long-term direction of travel that is deliverable and affordable for households and businesses. It will also provide certainty to building owners and the supply chain. Through the work of Home Energy Scotland and the support available through our Warmer Homes Scotland scheme, we will take forward measures to ensure we offer practical solutions to encourage energy efficiency and to enable families to stay warm. The purpose of the Heat in Buildings Bill must be to enable practical assistance to be made available to households and businesses to support energy efficiency and to improve the quality of heating systems. We will also set a clear timetable for the delivery of roughly 24,000 additional electric vehicle charge points by 2030, and we will make it easier for people to walk, wheel or cycle through our Active Travel Infrastructure Fund, the National Cycle Network and our People in Place programme. These commitments are good for our communities and good for our environment. Plain and simple, they are good for Scotland. Presiding Officer, beyond the question of my government's priorities and the specifics of the programme, there is one further question I want to address. My ministers are in the public service. I want my government to set the highest standard of propriety and integrity. I want trust to be at the heart of our relationship with the people of Scotland. That is why I intend to make changes to strengthen the Scottish Ministerial Code. Investigations into alleged breaches of the Code will no longer happen only at the instruction of the First Minister. Independent advisers will be able to launch their own investigations whenever they feel it is warranted. And where there has been a breach, they will be able to advise on appropriate sanctions. These changes will significantly strengthen the Code, significantly strengthen the role of the independent advisers, whose terms of reference will also be published. I expect to publish the new Code by the end of this calendar year. Presiding Officer, Scotland is a country of many strengths. Our economy is founded on industries of global reach in energy, financial services, food and drink, tourism, life sciences and advanced manufacturing. Our education system is high-performing and includes a number of world-class universities. Our natural environment is of the highest quality and provides the basis for so many of our economic strengths. Our talented and creative population is our greatest asset enhanced by those who choose to make their future here. Our society is bound together by a strong sense of social justice, of acting together to build the common good, to ensure everyone in our country is able to fulfil their potential. Yes, we face challenges, but if properly focused and motivated, I am optimistic and confident that the inherent strengths of our country will help us overcome those challenges. With goodwill and with a relentless focus on delivering for the people of Scotland, I believe the resources available to us can be used to help us eradicate child poverty, build prosperity, improve our public services and play our part in protecting the planet. That is the focus of this programme for government, and I commend it to Parliament.
Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on Programme for Government 2024 to 2025. I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press their request to speak buttons. And I now call on Douglas Ross up to 11 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Today we've seen the publication of the final report into the appalling tragedy that saw 72 people die in Grenfell Tower 7 years ago. The inquiry chair, Sir Martin Moore-Bick, said that the residents were badly let down by organisations that should have protected them. And the report found that the fire at Grenfell Tower was a culmination of decades of failure by central government and other bodies in positions of responsibility. We all have a responsibility to learn from the lessons of this tragedy and ensure that it can never happen again. The First Minister said in his statement that he would be looking at the report, and I hope his government will give a very early opportunity for members to debate and discuss that report here and how the 58 recommendations will be implemented should they affect us here in Scotland, and also to provide an update on the cladding remediation programme here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, in responding to this year's programme for government, we cannot ignore the fiscal context in which the SNP Scottish Government has found itself in. Yes, there are pressures brought in by the new Labour Government, a government which within weeks of taking office stripped millions of pensioners of their winter fuel payment. A shameful decision that is being replicated by this SNP Scottish Government here at Holyrood. But the Nationalists really only have themselves to blame for the mess that they find themselves in. Yesterday, the Finance Secretary said that all members of Parliament must face up to the challenge. But it's SNP ministers and SNP MSPs that need to follow her advice. Even their own budget forecaster has said that, and I quote, much of the pressure comes from the Scottish Government's own decisions. There's no one left to blame. There's nowhere left to hide. What we got yesterday, and in the programme for government today, are SNP choices. And what we got yesterday was SNP cuts that will have an impact on delivering the programme for government. So let's just remember where these cuts were. Yesterday we had cut to the economy budget, a budget held by the Deputy First Minister, but she's accepting her budget will be cut. The justice budget, cut. Rural affairs budget, cut. Transport budget, cut. Education and skills budget, cut. Health and social care budget, cut. It seems the only area that was protected was Angus Robertson's portfolio, the Constitution. The money the SNP government used to promote independence is more important to them than the vital public services that the people of Scotland expect to be delivered by this government. For years, the SNP government has patted itself on the back for their policies and decisions. But now the public can see that they are paying the price for these SNP choices. The SNP have also, for years, praised themselves at running a balanced budget. Let that claim never be uttered in this chamber again. They have lost control of the budget here in Scotland. They are filling the gap time after time. And I will give way in a moment to the Deputy First Minister. But let us be very clear. It is decisions and choices they have made that have led to a huge black hole in the Scottish Government's budget. I'll give way to the Deputy First Minister.
Can the member confirm that the Scottish Government by law is not allowed to overspend its budget? And can it name 1 year in the last 17 where the Scottish Government has overspent its budget?
Douglas Ross. Well, if they hadn't overspent their budget, they wouldn't be pulling in hundreds of millions of pounds from the ScotWind budget. You know, that money is coming in to fill the gaps they have created in their own budget. Choices by SNP ministers year after year are having an impact. They also promised that if we pay more in taxes in Scotland, that would fund better public services. Yet instead, the government is cutting from almost every department that delivers these public services. With the SNP, you pay more and you get less. Now, time and time again, Scottish Conservatives have warned against these raising taxes and the impact it would have for people and businesses across Scotland and our economy, and it was ignored. And what we are getting now is, because of this financial mismanagement, a threadbare programme for a government which has been published today. This was John Swinney's big moment. This was his chance to reset the SNP government after 17 years, to boldly launch his premiership as First Minister. Has he really been waiting 25 years to deliver that speech we have just listened to? Because what we got was a programme of tired old promises that should have been delivered years ago. In so many areas, we see any suggestion of bold action watered down or abandoned in favour of restating existing commitments. The First Minister is basically trying to make it impossible for his government to fail by promising nothing. Under John Swinney, the SNP are admitting that the SNP are out of ideas and out of ambition for Scotland. Let's just look at some of the proposals that we've heard today. And on eradicating child poverty, we all want to see that. We all want to do that. And the First Minister is just coming up, and I know what he's going to ask about. But why has it taken 17 years? He's been in government for 16 of those years. Why now, in 2024, is eradicating child poverty finally a priority for this government? And will he accept, as I'm about to allow his intervention, will he accept that child poverty has gone up since the SNP came to power in 2007? First Minister.
I'm grateful to Mr Ross for giving way, and I'd point out to Mr Ross that the government of which I have been a member, although I had a year out of government, the government I've been a member of introduced the Scottish Child Payment, the boldest and biggest intervention to tackle child poverty in Europe since the 1980s. And the reason why we had to do that was because child poverty was spiralling because of the austerity that Douglas Ross voted for in the House of Commons when he was there. And now, child poverty in Scotland is significantly lower than the rest of the United Kingdom because of well, it's higher than when we came to office because of Tory austerity. That's why it's higher. And finally, what position is Douglas Ross in to lecture me about child poverty when he voted for the two-child cap and is proud of it?
Douglas Ross. John Swinney speaks about legislation he introduced and the governments he was part of introduced. What about the legislation in 2017 that set the target for reducing child poverty? Those targets have failed to be met. They are not going to be met because the SNP's governance of Scotland has seen child poverty increase rather than go downwards or be eradicated. Some other issues that are in this programme for government, which are important. The NHS. It is crucial that we focus on our NHS because every single one of us will have cases. They are articulated on a weekly basis here in the Scottish Parliament of patients suffering. But we didn't get any proper new information from the First Minister or the government today. It's going to be more of the same. They're going to deliver these changes despite a huge cut to the to the NHS budget announced yesterday. I don't think any patient or family of a patient watching this programme for government today will take any comfort from what they heard from John Swinney. We did certainly welcome his proposals to change ministerial investigations. I wonder if it's belatedly a recognition from John Swinney that he got it wrong over supporting his friend Michael Matheson. That shameful episode brought shame not just on John Swinney as a person, but the office of First Minister. And I wonder if that is the reason he has decided to allow the independent ministerial adviser on the Code of Conduct to be involved. Because clearly, John Swinney got it wrong. He got it wrong backing his friend rather than doing the right thing for the people of Scotland. Now, there's an awful lot being chuntered from the front bench. What has not been said in 30 minutes of the First Minister's speech was a single mention of drugs or alcohol. That did not register once. Not a single mention. It is not a priority for John Swinney or this SNP government. Just a month after we heard that in 2023, 1,172 people in Scotland died from drugs, an increase of 121 from the year before. If that is going to be a priority, a defining mission of his government to end these deaths, they don't even get a mention. Really, that is shameful from this SNP government that took its eye off the ball with drug and alcohol deaths and is still doing it by ignoring the situation as it is right now. Presiding Officer, this programme for government is yet another wasted opportunity from this SNP government, and there are not many left for them. Because, as well as things being included in this programme for government, there are other things that have been excluded. There was one small reference to the A9. Where was the commitment to fully dual the A96 from Inverness to Aberdeen? So the First Minister's had a lot to say, and I'll take his intervention. Does his government still support the dualling of the A96 from Inverness to Aberdeen, and when will that crucial road be fully dualled? First Minister.
Nothing to say.
Nothing?
Nothing to say.
Nothing. He had plenty to say a minute ago. Really? A crucial link between two of Scotland's biggest cities, Inverness to Aberdeen, going through communities that have been promised a full upgrade and a dualling of that road for decades by the SNP. Not a single word in the programme for government, and now not a single word from the First Minister. The communities of the North East can see they are not a priority for this SNP First Minister. Presiding Officer, this is an opportunity, and this would have been an opportunity. Sorry, I thought someone wanted to intervene. They're just wondering why their First Minister had nothing to say about it. This could have been an opportunity to focus on education, on health, about improving public services, but instead we got more of the same failings, the same incompetence, the same focus on the wrong priorities. Do I have time to take an intervention? No. I'm sorry, I'm sure we'll hear from Keith Brown later. This is the same failings, the same incompetence and the same focus on the wrong priorities. This was the time to change gear, to turn things around and actually focus on the priorities of the Scottish public. Yet instead we have continuity from a First Minister who is the embodiment of continuity. The SNP have already lost control of public finances. They will soon lose control of the Scottish Government. They have let the people of Scotland down, and they deserve to pay the price for it.
Thank you. I can advise the Chamber we do have no time in hand, and therefore any interventions will have to be accommodated in the time allowance. And I call Anas Sarwar up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by acknowledging the powerful and important inquiry report on Grenfell Tower today? An absolute tragedy, and all those families that lost loved ones. And we all have a duty to stand with those families in their demand for justice, families that were ultimately failed. And I hope at some point we will have a response from government at the appropriate time about what lessons there are to be learned for us here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, we were promised that this was meant to be the great relaunch. We were promised a new focus, a new direction, a new plan. But instead we have more of the same sticky plaster approach, the same rehashed announcements and the same level of denial from the third First Minister in 3 years. Scotland needed a programme for government that recognised the scale of the challenge facing our country. Stagnating growth, record-long NHS waiting lists, education standards falling, rising levels of drug deaths not even mentioned by the First Minister when it's supposed to be a priority for this government. A housing emergency, but instead we have an SNP government with no vision, no strategy and no plan. And that's why it's getting clearer by the day that Scotland needs change. All the signs are that the SNP are just simply running down the clock on the last 18 months of this Parliament. Year after year, programme for government after programme for government, we see the same pattern. Long lists of pledges are made, a lot of which are well-intentioned and well-meaning, but it's immediately after the headlines have been grabbed that things start to fall apart. Many of the promises made by SNP First Ministers in these speeches simply never see the light of day. And for those that do, they are so often haphazard and incompetent in their implementation that it actually undermines the intentions of this Parliament and what people across the country want and demand. Worse still, I'm happy to take an intervention.
Deputy First Minister.
I just wondered if Labour's definition of change of things like promising energy bills being reduced by £300 but going up by 10% was really the kind of change that Scotland wants.
I'm glad the Deputy First Minister, who is meant to be the change candidate but actually never stood in the end, wants to try and blame a government that's been in power for 8 weeks rather than take responsibility for a government that's been in power for 17 years. So worse still, many plans pile yet more pressure on Scotland's public services and leave working people paying more and getting less. I'm just starting my contribution, but we can break through this managed decline and demonstrate that we can have effective government here in Scotland that delivers for the Scottish people. And that's why, unlike the gloom of John Swinney and Shona Robertson, I am actually optimistic for the future of this country and believe Scotland's best days lie ahead of it. But it requires a government that is honest.
I've allowed a bit of leeway for reaction to comments, but the ongoing brouhaha, particularly from the front benches, let it be said, is unacceptable. We will listen with some respect to the person who has the floor, and at the moment that's Anna Sarwar.
Well, Presiding Officer, they said they were going to learn the lessons from the verdict of the Scottish people. Clearly, they aren't learning the lessons of the verdict of the Scottish people. But it requires a government that is honest. The First Minister had 30 minutes to speak, and I'm barely into 3 minutes. But it requires a government that is honest about the scale of the challenge it faces and focuses on tackling them. That is the test this programme for government needed to pass, but it has failed. We need a government that gets on with the job of reversing the damage done by this SNP government, a party that has lost its way, is incompetent in government and is bad with people's money. The First Minister leads an administration that raises revenue, that can grow the economy and can make laws here in Scotland. It has control of our NHS, our schools, housing, justice and more. But more often than not, and we've heard it again today, they would rather talk about what they can't do rather than what they can do. Always making excuses and always somebody else to blame. And frankly, as the election in July showed, Scots are sick of it. We need to build an NHS fit for the future and there when people need it, so we can have a genuine catch-up plan and clear the backlog that now sits at 864,366 Scots. That's 1 in 6 Scots on an NHS waiting list, and those numbers continue to grow. It's the same story across the NHS, brave staff trying to deliver services in impossible circumstances, all while this government ignores the problem. The number of operations being scheduled remains well below pre-pandemic levels. There are still over 3,000 nursing and midwifery vacancies. Delayed discharge rates continue to rise, but despite this, nothing in this programme for government will tackle the record-long waits in our NHS and get our healthcare system working for patients again. The First Minister declared that this was a programme for government for Scotland's children, but it's clear this incompetent government yet again has no plan for Scotland's young people. Just yesterday, his government cut mental health support to young people. Nearly 1 in 6 children and young people who need support with mental health are forced to wait more than 4 months to get help, and shamefully, 1 in 4 children asking for help with a mental health crisis are turned away. Families abandoned by the SNP government, and his plan does nothing to help them. And it's the same story in education. The SNP has broken its promise on the attainment gap, with results showing it's widening on John Swinney's watch. And let's not forget, this is the same man who attempted to downgrade the grades of working-class kids during the pandemic. And on his watch, Scotland is falling in the international league tables. And for all the talk of teacher numbers, over 400 teacher posts being cut in Glasgow alone, all while violence in our schools is on the rise. But despite that, nothing in this programme will get to grips with the crisis in Scotland's schools. And in the past 12 months, we have seen record levels of drug deaths in this country, and nothing in this programme for government to attempt to deal with that crisis. Scotland's housing crisis is getting worse. Hard-working Scots looking to buy their first home, priced out of the market, and too many struggling to make ends meet while rents rise and rise. A shocking 10,000 children in temporary accommodation without a home to call their own. And across Scotland, communities are left feeling unsafe because our justice system is broken too on their watch, and we have a crumbling police estate and a huge court backlog. Again, nothing in this programme for government to address that. So this programme for government is not up to the scale of the challenges facing Scotland, but change is possible. In 2026, we can elect a government that is optimistic and positive about the future for Scotland. A government about service, not party. A government about delivering for the people of Scotland, not seeing politics as a game. A government of decency, integrity and honesty, not defending our pals. A First Minister who wants to announce a change to the ministerial code today, but forgets his own behaviour in the Alex Salmond inquiry or indeed the Michael Matheson scandal. A government that gets on with strengthening and reforming our institutions in Scotland, left weaker after 17 years of SNP government. A government that wants to change our country for the better and realise the hopes and aspirations of the people of Scotland. A government of service for Scotland. A government that will reform our NHS and make it fit for the future. A government that will get our education system back on track and make it once again the envy of the world. A government that will partner with business to jumpstart economic growth and deliver prosperity for Scotland. A government that will take head-on the housing emergency and realise the dream of home ownership. A government that delivers change. Scotland needs change. It's sick of this failing SNP government, and Scottish Labour is ready to deliver it.
Thank you. I now call Lorna Slater. Up to 5 minutes. Ms Slater.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I wish to associate myself with colleagues' remarks around the tragedy at the Grenfell Tower. Today's programme for government is billed as prioritising future generations, but the decisions made this week by the Scottish Government do exactly the opposite. We cannot take today's programme for government on its own without looking at the context of yesterday's fiscal update. The slashing of public spending, particularly on our journey to net zero, is selling out the future of our young people. The suggestion that we can continue with business as usual to deliver all the same things whilst spending less money is quite frankly delusional. Some clarity about what the Scottish Government will not be able to deliver would be welcome. The Scottish Greens support the First Minister's vision to eradicate child poverty, but the shelving of plans to roll out free school meals for all primary school children, as it appears to be set out in today's programme for government, will make that worse, not better. In addition to funding and programmes, ensuring our children have a future worth living, a future full of opportunity and hope, also requires us to make the tough decisions that are now required to prevent catastrophic climate breakdown. You can't grow a green economy without substantial investment, and more of this investment needs to come from the private sector. That's exactly what the ScotWind funding was. This was supposed to be our green sovereign wealth fund, to invest in solutions like the climate and nature emergencies, like community-owned renewables, and training the next generation of engineers. What we saw yesterday was the Scottish Government emptying the pot, spending the last remaining ScotWind funding, whilst slashing net zero investment, and continuing to give handouts to big business. On the planned Climate Change Targets Bill, the Scottish Greens have reluctantly accepted that whilst the 2030 net zero target is now out of reach, it is due to 15 years, during which time governments fixated on targets whilst failing to make the big changes needed to actually drive down emissions. The Scottish Greens can only support a change to climate targets if it is accompanied by a significant ramping up of action, a climate reset, where we finally stop building new roads and new fossil fuel power stations, where we put climate change at the top of the political and public agenda, where we significantly ramp up the decarbonisation of our homes and public buildings. I am also deeply concerned by the failure to include a bill to ban conversion practices in the legislative programme. This bill started out as a petition to this Parliament over 4 years ago from campaigners whose lives had been impacted by the trauma of so-called conversion therapy. The Human Rights and Equalities Committee concluded over 2 years ago that Scotland-specific legislation be brought forward as soon as possible. And while the Scottish Greens would wholly welcome an eventual UK-wide ban, we in Scotland have the mandate to deliver a watertight ban now, which will end this cruel and inhumane torture that is going on behind closed doors in Scotland. The Scottish Government should confirm when they will press the button on this draft legislation, and it must ensure that we have legislation in place before the next election. Now is the time to show boldness, not to cower to the reactionary forces of the right. This is the first programme for government in 4 years, which the Scottish Greens did not co-design. And quite frankly, it shows. Continuing to hand out tax breaks to private companies whilst scrapping free bus travel for asylum seekers is not something the Scottish Greens would ever have agreed to. Emptying out our Green Sovereign Wealth Fund whilst cutting overall funding for net zero by £23 million is a betrayal of future generations and abandoning our responsibility to tackle the climate emergency. Shelving vital legislation on equalities and human rights cannot be blamed on budget cuts and can only be put down to cowardice from the SNP government. We have 18 months left of this session of Parliament to build a fairer and greener Scotland, which leaves our society and our planet in a better shape for future generations. The SNP may have given up on that mission, but the Scottish Greens never will.
Okay, I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton up to 5 minutes. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. This Parliament reconvenes this week for the first time since the UK general election. And that was an election that in many ways the public, the people of Scotland, the people we are here to serve, rendered their judgment on the focus and the priorities of the SNP government. It was a brutal night for the SNP, but it was a historic night for the Liberal Democrats. It saw us overtake the Scottish Conservative Party, come within touching distance in terms of Scottish MPs returned to Westminster of the Scottish National Party, and viewed from space, we now represent more geographical territory north of the border than even the Scottish Labour Party. People place their trust in us, and we will repay that trust in full. As we return to this chamber, Presiding Officer, we are faced with the brutal spending cuts which are set to cause untold damage and pain to public services and households across Scotland. They will define the remainder of this Parliament. Some of that pain is the residual legacy of the damage, the economic damage caused by the Conservative government. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Much of the pressure comes from the Scottish Government's own decisions. Such is the judgment of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and it paints a bleak picture of this government's management of our finances. Presiding Officer, it's not hard to see how we got here. The Scottish Government has played fast and loose with the Scottish people's money and squandered so much of our potential. £1 billion ministerial takeover of social care that will strip power away from our communities. Ferries that are millions upon millions of pounds over budget and years overdue. And Scotland's precious seabed sold off on the cheap. Presiding Officer, there was a time when the First Minister's predecessor, of whom we seldom speak, called Scotland's renewable potential the Saudi Arabia of the North. This also from a party which attacked Margaret Thatcher for decades for failing to set up a sovereign wealth fund for the oil beneath our seabed. Yesterday, the SNP destroyed any chance of such a long-term fund being established from the wind farms now being built upon it. It's Scotland's wind, presiding officer, but the SNP have blown it. The government still haven't been entirely clear, but it now looks as though all of that one-off revenue is fully committed. In which case, yesterday's announcement may plug half of the hole they have created in our national finances, but the question remains, what on earth plugs that gap next year? Presiding officer, the SNP claim to be stronger for Scotland, but the facts do not bear that out. In this programme for government, there has been no mention of drug deaths, still at record heights, of reducing teacher contact time or recruiting 3,500 teachers or assistants. No mention of that at all. No reassurance on culture. And I think most criminally, what we are hearing with a £19 million cut to mental health is the fact that already, even though the First Minister has reset the target to clear down child and adolescent mental health waiting times by December 2025, that is a new target because they missed the original one of March 2023. The First Minister likes to talk about conducting politics in a more grown-up fashion. Well, in grown-up politics, you have to listen to what the country is telling you. The SNP were humbled at the ballot box, and people are speaking. It is now self-evident that his party is incapable of listening. The country is tired. It's tired of feeling like nothing works anymore, of working harder, of falling further behind. Well, as we debate the priorities of this government for this parliamentary year ahead, let me spell out the messages that we have heard door by door and street by street from the people of this country. We need to fix our health services with fast access to GPs, dentists and mental health services, to deliver world-beating education and a green jobs revolution to get our economy growing again. Insulate homes so that the pensioners who are having their winter fuel payments removed by the Labour government have a chance of staying warm this winter. That's what the Liberal Democrats want to do, to fight for a fair deal for carers, the thousands of people with long COVID who this government has ignored for years, support small businesses, protect local authority funding and stop sewage being dumped in our rivers. Infighting in the Scottish National Party has sucked focus and dedication away from the central mission of public service that should define any government of any stripe. They remain divided, but Scotland has signalled that it wants to move on from that division. A house divided cannot stand. In 20 months' time, there will be young people casting their votes for the first time who have only ever known SNP rule. It is well past time that they knew a Scotland not weighed down or held back by a government so out of touch.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call first Michelle Thompson, to be followed by Liz Smith. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I'm sure the First Minister wishes that we, like independent Ireland, had the issue of how to spend a surplus of around €8.6 billion. Little Ireland, disdained by the UK commentariat after some property exuberance pre-credit crunch, has come back with bigger tiger teeth, taking the opportunity to replace the UK as a gateway to Europe, pitching well above its weight in the world. It's unique in wrestling with a surplus challenge. Meanwhile, the UK economy, one of the hardest hit of all the large advanced economies and the slowest to recover from the credit crunch, was economically badly prepared for the COVID pandemic and has struggled since. No optimism can be seen from the new UK Labour government. They've adopted the Tory fiscal rules, rules which are made up anyway and underpin the fact that austerity is a policy choice. They fully embrace the idiocy of Brexit, and the only thing we can be certain of, contrary to when Labour were last in power and told things can only get better, is that things will absolutely get much worse. Never forget, this is the backdrop in which we are required to operate in Scotland, where we must be grateful for the capital expenditure crumbs that see a 20% reduction in monies available to invest and grow our economy, and where the revenue budget has not taken account of the height of CPI inflation at 18.9% over the past few years. So what of today's programme for government?
I'm very aware it's been drawn together in the most difficult of times. The UK budget won't be till the end of October, and the final amount available for the Scottish Government not known until February 2025. So I celebrate what I have heard today in it. And I'm pleased to see that it targets key areas rather than the broad brush approach adopted previously. And I'm especially pleased to see its focus on economic growth. Now, a couple of points. I welcome, of course, the signing of the Falkirk Growth Deal, the focus on a just transition for Grangemouth, and that the resources will now be made available to allow Creative Scotland to open the Open Fund. And I also note the investment in tech scale is very important. However, what's most pleasing to me is the £600 million in affordable housing and a further £100 million for mid-market rent homes. And I note with interest the comments around stage 2 of the housing bill that sounds optimistic in recognising the need for developers to have a clear line of sight over future margins and a return on investment. So I really welcome that. So lastly, to return to Ireland, their intention is not to spend their surplus. They plan to save for the future. And on that, I will again gently express my concern at the ScotWind funds being used for revenue. Now, I fully accept the Finance Secretary will protect as much money as she can. But can I note that the imperative of net zero and the imperative of growing the economy both hinge on using this money, ideally by crowding in private investment, and the Scottish Government potentially taking a golden share to reach the £1.5 billion set out in the statement. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Liz Smith to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Smith.
Thank you. Now, yesterday during her statement, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance said that she felt that the opposition members should put on the table what we would do differently with the nation's finances. I agree with her with that, and I look forward to taking up that challenge in the next 3 months. But before I do, can I just say something about what I think has happened this summer? Firstly, there has been confirmation from the independent analysts that the fiscal predicament in which the Scottish Government finds itself has largely resulted from decisions that have been taken right here in Holyrood. Secondly, we are nowhere near level of public service reform that we would like to be, and therefore we are not delivering the efficiencies and the greater savings that certainly the Finance Committee has been calling for quite some time. And I think there has also been a recognition in quite a few quarters that it is time to examine, with evidence, the case for some universal payments. And that was something I noted very carefully yesterday that the Cabinet Secretary acknowledged. Now, take away all the constitutional debate about how to interpret the JERS statistics, and I know that's difficult, but the current demographic trends, the fact that we have a very high incidence of economic activity, which is true elsewhere, plus the fact that the Scottish economy has been seriously lagging behind the UK economy for at least a decade, we are not in any way producing the growth which we desperately need in order to pay for a much increasing dependent population. And that's a point. Yes, of course.
First Minister.
I'm grateful to Liz Smith for giving me. One of the issues that Liz Smith has championed in her time in the Parliament has been the issue of migration. She has been very open-minded about the benefits of economic migration to Scotland. I wonder if, in her analysis of the economic situation that we face, and the importance that's attached to population growth as a driver of economic growth, if she would reaffirm her support for some of the measures I announced today about a rural visa pilot, for example, to encourage and to motivate greater migration into some parts of our country.
Liz Smith.
Yes, I will, because I've said that before and I will repeat that again. I've also said that about student visas. I think I don't want a devolution of migration policy, but yes, I think there is a case for that, so I'm very happy to put that back on the record. Now, can I just come back to what business is saying? Because they worry greatly about the increasing tax burden that is upon them and the effect that that's having on middle to high earners, who we desperately need for some of the industries that the First Minister was talking about. We have to attract them to Scotland. That's financial services, energy, technology, food and drink. Scotland has the latent potential, but we need to develop that and develop it fast. So can I just say what I think needs to happen? Firstly, the budget choices, as well as the rhetoric, have to reflect economic growth. And that didn't happen last February when, for some inexplicable reason, the SNP government made an 8.3% real terms cut in the economy portfolio. I don't understand that. I didn't understand it at the time, and I don't understand it now. Because not surprisingly, that budget was met with considerable dismay across the business community. Secondly, as the Finance Committee has been highlighting for quite some time, there has to be meaningful public sector reform which will make the public sector more efficient, because we're nowhere near being able to do that just now. From the evidence that the committee has taken and from the analysis that accompanies that, it's just not an option to go on as we are. In fact, I would suggest to the First Minister that that should also be a very considerable priority for the Scottish Government, because in terms of the delivery, it's all very well paying public sector workers more, as we would obviously all like to do, but we can't go on doing that without getting better services in return, because the public's not going to wear that at all. And on tax, the very last thing that we should be doing is to make Scotland uncompetitive with England, because that's exactly what's happening just now. And yesterday I flagged up the fact that I think there is a very different opinion between the Deputy First Minister about tax policy and the First Minister. I'll just finish it in a minute, because I think this point has to be taken on board by those in government, because you're giving out a mixed message as to what has to happen. And if there's one thing that I finish off on, Deputy Presiding Officer, it is that. Please, can we get some clarity about tax policy and how that is supposed to help economic growth?
Thank you. And I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Pam Duncan-Glancy. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This programme for government is necessarily both realistic and robust, as a prolonged era of austerity imposed upon Scotland by successive Labour, Coalition and Tory UK governments over the past 16 years limits Scottish Government actions in the fiscal context in which it operates. I wholeheartedly agree with the Finance Secretary's response to last week's Prime Ministerial speech when she said, and I quote, "The political choices being made by the new UK Government will fundamentally damage the Scottish Government's ability to deliver public services in Scotland." It's a rerun of 1997 all over again. Back then, New Labour's first budget cut public spending. As a Glasgow City Councillor, I saw cuts in mass redundancies imposed, leading to demonstrations in George Square, and councillors being sneaked out the back door. There are other parallels from Labour's déjà vu playbook. Despite no mention in its 97 manifesto, immediately the results were in, Labour announced the introduction of university tuition fees, cynically calculating it wouldn't impact on them electorally 4 or 5 years later. This time it's a winter fuel payment. There was no inkling in the manifesto. No doubt Labour hope voters will simply forget. No impact assessment was undertaken on withdrawing the payment from 10 million UK pensioners. Labour's manifesto didn't mention rising energy bills or prisoner releases in England either, or cuts to AI development in Scotland. And no one believes the Chancellor didn't know about the financial black hole bequeathed by the Tories. All shadow ministers routinely meet civil service heads and Treasury officials on the run-up to a UK general election, even if it hadn't been telegraphed by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The new UK prospectus forces Scottish ministers to make tough decisions and reallocate limited resources after years working to offset the worst successes of UK austerity and welfare cuts. Mr Mara.
Briefly, Michael Mara.
I appreciate the member giving way. Doesn't it recognise that OBR have actually noted the fact that many of the issues that were bequeathed to Labour in that the budget were a massive black hole, including particularly issues around asylum seeker and refugee homelessness in the UK. And they've actually written a letter dictating that.
Gibson. Everyone knew about. This year, mitigation of UK welfare cuts will cost this government £133.7 million. I believe cuts telegraphed by the Chancellor mean those resources must be redirected into devolved areas. Of course, according to Anna Sarwar, Labour, and I quote, will put Scotland at the heart of government, close quote. This includes Secretary of State for Scotland Ian Murray, who frequently criticised SNP mitigation, stating, and I quote, "The only sure way to get the bedroom tax repealed will be to elect a Labour government." Labour should now scrap the bedroom tax across the UK, eliminating any need for mitigation. Indeed, if the Labour government also mirrored the £26.70 per child per week Scottish child payment across the UK, it would free up £429 million a year for Scottish ministers to invest in further anti-poverty measures and public services. But don't hold your breath. For Scotland to escape the cycle of UK government cuts and emergency reallocation of funds mid-year, we must widen our tax base by growing our economy. Resources must increasingly focus on innovation, research and development and start-ups, and I was pleased to hear the First Minister's commitment to this. We have the talent, skills and many facilities essential to become Europe's fastest growing start-up economy. Scotland's 42 million tech scaler network, mentoring and incubation space for new tech businesses, has already levered in 70 million of private monies. Scottish enterprises drown up levels of innovation, internationalisation and investment, working with over 1,300 companies and partners to enable, create or safeguard 16,700 jobs, including a 5-year high in new jobs from foreign direct investment, 60% in the energy transition. My own constituency will enjoy £1.4 billion of XLCC investment into Hunterston, creating 900 direct green jobs on site by 2028. In life sciences, Scotland's second biggest export, securing investment out with Cambridge, Oxford and London is not easy. Dundee University supports 9,400 jobs and generated almost £1 billion for our economy last year, not least through its Drug Discovery Unit, which is unique in excellence, research scale and industrial partnerships with the private sector. Presiding Officer, just £5 million proof of concept money from Scottish ministers could, the university attests, lever in £200 million more of further private investment. Stimulating economic growth will enable public service delivery to the high standard expected by Scotland's people. The programme for government has noble aims and objectives, and I urge members to support it.
Thank you. I now call Pam Duncan-Glancy to be followed by Emma Harper. Up to 4 minutes. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to be able to speak today on this year's programme for government, because the stakes couldn't be higher. For too many of my constituents in the region of Glasgow, and indeed across Scotland, NHS waiting lists are too long, the attainment gap is widening, teachers are losing their jobs, disabled people are living without the services they need, social care is on its knees, and the SNP's financial chaos means more cuts are looming. At a time when people needed their government to step up, their government has stepped back, grown out of touch and run out of ideas. Last week, the First Minister met with Glasgow Disability Alliance, who I know will have raised concern over reduced services like social care. But yesterday, the Finance Secretary told the Finance Committee there are to be £13 million of cuts in adult social care, partly because uptake of the new ILF that they delayed delivery of wasn't what it should be. These cuts will terrify disabled people. And, Presiding Officer, the promised transition strategy doesn't even get a mention, despite the government rejecting my bill on the promise that a strategy would come. This has to change. And on health, Presiding Officer, I heard nothing in today's statement that will help my constituent who's been waiting for knee surgery for 2 years, or promises on mental health waits ring hollow when the Cabinet Secretary for Finance slashed £18.18 million from that budget yesterday. Presiding Officer, people in Glasgow deserve better. So too do the people of Scotland. None more than young people, and I want to use the rest of my time today to talk about them and education. The programme for government says it includes implementing the delayed behaviour action plan, but there's no resource behind it to help staff in schools deliver it. Yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary dodged my suggestion of ditching the Centre for Teaching Excellence that no one wants and giving that money to schools to implement the plan, and I hope the First Minister might consider this today. I will take that intervention.
I thank the member for the opportunity to clarify. I did not suggest that her suggestion was ditched. What I said was we need to continue to invest in Scotland's teaching profession through the Centre for Teaching Excellence. And I think we need additionality. The question I put to the member, and perhaps you can answer it today, is when am I going to receive confirmation from the Labour Government on the alleged consequences that are coming as a result of VAT changes to the private sector, and on the consequences from the 6,500 extra teachers that the Labour Party were elected on? I would like confirmation on this so that I can provide our schools with
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's intervention, and she knows fine well that she will hear clarity on that after the budget. And the Cabinet Secretary also says that delivering excellence and equity in education is our top priority, but that she can't do it with fewer teachers. But the government is slashing teacher numbers. Just ask people in Glasgow. It's also overworking them and stripping resources from education and local government. And how can we have the highest quality learning for all when this government is presiding over a 17% attainment gap that goes back, I'm afraid, to this First Minister's time as Education Secretary? The government used to plan to close that gap, and I note today that they've revised down their ambition to simply reduce it. The First Minister says his government will drive improvement, raise standards and ensure the needs of learners are at the forefront of their work by implementing curriculum improvement and progressing reform of the national education bodies. But I'm afraid a rebrand is not reform. No effective voice for teachers or learners is not reform. And letting the qualifications body that marked down the poorest pupils mark its own homework is not reform. The First Minister also said much of growth today, but there was nothing there to help colleges or universities who are essential for that and who are struggling under, and I quote from evidence we had in the Education Committee, their toughest funding settlement after years of SNP mismanagement. Presiding Officer, this SNP's government's record on education is a litany of failure and broken promises on closing the attainment gap, class sizes, non-contact time, free school meals for all pupils, or digital devices. It can't go on. We need an end to broken promises and economic financial mismanagement. Scotland needs hope, and my colleagues and I, they have it, because we believe our best days lie ahead of us. We can turn the page on economic mismanagement and return to a Scotland where everyone has the opportunity to flourish. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I now call Emma Harper to be followed by Rachel Hamilton. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in the programme for government debate. So much has been mentioned which will need to be dissected in the coming weeks. This year's programme for government has set out clear actions to deliver real change for the people of Scotland. This against the most challenging financial backdrop since our Parliament was reconvened. The Prime Minister was clear last week that the UK budget to delivered in October will be painful, and the reality is that the UK's finances will inevitably affect the funding available to us here in Scotland. The SNP Scottish Government will continue to prioritise action to eradicate child poverty, to grasp the opportunities of delivering net zero, and to grow the economy by attracting business investment and by bolstering our public services. While the Scottish Government will work with the UK Government wherever it can, it will continue to urge the UK Government to drop its impending damaging austerity agenda. Presiding Officer, I'm just going to make 2 points. Number one is Labour's shameless cut to the winter fuel payment, which will hit older people in Dumfries and Galloway and the borders particularly hard. And the second point is how the PFG will benefit Dumfries and Galloway. Labour's plan to strictly means test the winter fuel payment in England and Wales sees the Scottish Government funding for this new devolved benefit suddenly reduced by £168 million. Devolving a benefit shortly after removing almost its entire budget is disrespectful to everybody involved in shaping the new policy in Scotland. This cut undermines the devolution settlement and ignores the importance of this payment to Scottish households who face harsher winters and higher energy costs. This will hit our pensioners in rural communities like ND&G and the borders particularly hard. The fact that this cut is coming from Labour, the party which just 6 weeks ago said that they would, and I quote, give pensioners security in retirement. In June, Anna Sarwar said, "Read my lips, no austerity under Labour." And by the way, that soundbite, "read my lips," actually came from right-wing Republican President George Bush Sr.'s 1988 address to the Republican Convention. So it's hardly surprising that Anna Sarwar is aligning himself with the right-wing Republican playbook. Labour's decision was made without any consultation with the Scottish Government, undermining the commitments given by Keir Starmer to establish a better working relationship. It's shameful, and I call on the UK Government to reverse this cut. Presiding Officer, I do welcome that the SNP Government has prioritised economic growth, helping businesses, including in D&G, to grow and flourish. From tourism to finance and technology to food and drink exports, the Scottish Government will work to create growth, create jobs and maximise the huge economic opportunities that lie ahead. I welcome that the First Minister has included programme for government items in terms of innovation, supporting entrepreneurs and AI and digital technology. We know how valuable AI can be in healthcare and remind Chamber that I am still a registered nurse. The First Minister is clear the SNP Scottish Government is a firmly pro-business administration. Scotland is open for business. The SNP is acutely aware of the enormous pressures facing businesses across the country and is taking decisive steps to offer support despite limited powers and working within a challenging budget. This includes investing more than £5 million across the Scottish Government to grow and transform our economic landscape, using every tool at our disposal to maximise economic growth for a clear purpose. So, finally, Presiding Officer, I welcome this programme for government. It's good for our priorities, it's good for our people, and it's good for our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Michael Mara. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the First Minister's statement today, but the time for empty promises is running out. Every year, the government sets out their agenda in an attempt to improve lives across Scotland, yet when it comes to implementing it, they consistently fall short of the mark. Instead of delivering for Scotland, the Scottish Government, through their own spending choices, have delivered an ever-gaping financial black hole. Presiding Officer, it's alarming that beyond ditching their own climate change goals, that the SNP would defund conservation to plug other holes they have created in their own spending decisions. Councils and Nature Scot will be left with nothing to spend on preserving our beautiful natural environment for future generations. We, on these benches, urge ministers to reconsider the damage this will cause to at-risk species and properly fund councils for any deals they have struck elsewhere. Nature should not be a trivial consideration for the SNP, as this would suggest. Presiding Officer, as in previous years, this programme for government is nothing more than rhetoric designed to conceal a lack of substance and ambition. And rural communities will again be disappointed with today's announcements. Freed from the shackles of the Green Party, the government had the opportunity to bring forward sensible and pragmatic plans that would afford them the chance to reset. But whilst the Butte House agreement is over, its legacy of broken promises continues. Rural issues were scarcely mentioned in the First Minister's statement or in the programme for government, and farmers are still out of pocket by the tune of £46 million of ring-fenced funding. It was taken from the agricultural budget, leaving those who rely on that money with uncertainty and feeling let down. Yes?
Jim Fairley. Does the member recall when we were in the Rural Affairs Committee that Johnny Hall sat in the chamber or in the committee and told our committee that not a single penny of the funding that was being delivered to agricultural community had not been spent, and that was a Treasury issue, that the Treasury confirmed that, not the Scottish Government?
Still Hamilton.
Well, Jim Fairley will remember all the to and fro in the chamber with the Finance Secretary who promised to return that money, the £46 million. So the Finance Secretary, your own Finance Secretary in this SNP government, has acknowledged that that money has been removed, and so has the Cabinet Secretary, Marie Goujon. So Jim Fairley is confusing the issue with his own Cabinet's account of and recollection. I welcome the First Minister's acknowledgement that we need to build more homes, but with only 10% of new affordable homes being built in rural areas, which account for 17% of the population, it's clear that their actions to date have failed to address this urgent issue, exacerbating the issues of depopulation and driving young people out of their own areas. Yes?
Very briefly, Christine Graham.
Does the member think it unfortunate that the Tory-led Borders Council handed back £8 million to the Scottish Government because they failed to spend it timelessly on building houses?
Rachel Hamilton.
So what I think is that the housing budget needs to sort out the issues of depopulation across Scotland, and it's not doing that because it's driving young people out of Scotland. And moreover, so is the taxation policy. Significant inequalities relating to mental health care for adults and young people continue to hit rural communities. Young people in the borders are being let down today. They were let down yesterday, last month, last year with this government, with only 40% starting CAMS treatment within the 18-week target. And, Presiding Officer, I'm contacted daily by constituents who struggle to access mental health support. It's simply unacceptable that my constituents and our constituents and residents across Scotland must wait until 2025 for the government to fix their own problems over this. I will conclude, Presiding Officer. There's so much more I could say, but let's just say, Presiding Officer, we had a fantastic potential for rural communities, and for this government to deliver, they've let them down.
Thank you. I now call Michael Mara to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It started off with a rather sleepy affair from the Scottish Government, and it is a fair reflection, I think, of a government that frankly has lost touch with the public. After years of scandal and incompetence, it has lost its way. And as we heard yesterday, it simply cannot be trusted with the public's money. But it's also very difficult to see in this document that's set before us today and in the First Minister's speech what is actually new. We should perhaps look at some of last year's commitments. They failed to reduce the NHS waiting lists, as they promised last year, now at a record high, with almost 1 in 6 Scots facing those waits. They failed to improve the cancer outcomes, as they promised to do last year. Targets continue to be missed. They failed to close the attainment gap, as they promised to do, not just last year, but many years before, with attainment in schools actually dropping in the latest results. And they failed to produce key strategies for industry, for the energy sector and for our environment. They failed also to deal with our court backlog in our justice system. So it's little wonder that people are sceptical when they hear some of the promises and assurances given from the First Minister and some of his colleagues today. And I think he would look carefully at the example of our artistic sector, the Creative Scotland funding, and he would recognise, I hope, the very real concern and anger amongst that community, people's livelihoods, people who often earn very low wages, pursuing occupations that they love, adding very much not just to our economy, but to our society and our culture. And the great fear that they have lived in recent weeks is the very chaotic approach, frankly, of this government in terms of its finances and its agencies have put them in fear of their livelihoods. So I think it's right, no surprise, that there will still be protests here over this week from members of that sector who very much doubt some of the assurances that he has given them today. Because those cuts have been made previously, the money has been put back in place, then it's been taken out again, then it's been put back in again. It's just an example of the chaotic approach of his government. Meanwhile, a UK Labour government is getting on with fixing the foundations of our economy. It's rebuilding the start of a long job of rebuilding our public finances and putting politics back firmly in the service of working people. And I'll tell you what we're doing to start that process. We've introduced legislation to establish GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company that will bring down energy bills. Labour's New Deal for working people, banning exploitative zero-hour contracts and practices across our economy. We've commissioned a task force to take a deep dive and address the root causes of child poverty. We're closing loopholes in the non-dom status. No, thank you. We're closing loopholes in the non-dom status so we can put more money into our public services. So we're fixing those public spending issues, and that is absolutely critical. No, thank you. If only someone had thought of the idea of looking at the resources. No, thank you, sir. No, thank you. Again. If only someone had come up with the idea of looking at the resources, looking at the spending, perhaps having a review. They might have called it the resource spending review. And maybe the Deputy First Minister will recognise her words that we had to set out a realistic public spending framework for the years ahead that does not ignore the realities of our financial position. If only. Because it's exactly what her colleagues went on to do. On the 13th of June 2023, Shona Robson told a Finance Committee that the resource spending review was a bit of a blunt tool, that the policy needs to be more nuanced than that. More nuanced. Instead, we got 3 emergency budgets of financial chaos and cuts presided over by these Finance Secretary and this Cabinet. You need to wind up. Little wonder the mess that's been made, and little wonder the lack of faith that people will have in the statement that's been made today.
Thank you. I now call the final speaker in the open debate, Stuart McMillan, up to 4 minutes. Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we've been presented with a programme for government today that will prioritise action to eradicate child poverty, regardless of the mounting financial challenge facing this SNP government. The SNP and government already have a strong track record of improving lives in challenging circumstances, but the SNP want to go further, and that's why the First Minister has made eradicating child poverty his central mission, alongside working with business and industry to grow the economy, investing in net zero and also delivering stronger public services. Now, in Scotland, we already have significantly lower child poverty levels than England and Wales, but that should be no cause for celebration. We can and we must do more. Now, this year, the Scottish Government policies like the Scottish Child Payment are keeping an estimated 100,000 children out of relative poverty, and a further 40,000 children could have been lifted out of poverty if the Labour government, the new Labour Westminster government, had voted with the SNP to scrap the two-child benefit cap. In my Greenock and Inverclyde constituency, over 1,000 children are estimated to be missing out on receiving vital financial support due to this abhorrent policy. So no matter whether it's Labour or the Tories, the SNP government's efforts to eradicate child poverty is being undermined by Westminster at every single step. However, as the First Minister has emphasised today, and even when faced with unprecedented budgetary controls, due to the constitutional constraints, the Scottish Government's aim will be to improve people's lives by focusing on clear priorities that make the biggest difference. Now, I want to touch upon a few of the announcements made by the First Minister. Now, I welcome the announcement of the special support for disabled people to be enhanced across all local authorities by the summer of 2025. The reform of primary care to increase capacity and access to general practice, community pharmacy, dental and community eye care services by the end of 2026, and the additional £120 million for health boards to support continued improvements across a range of mental health services and treatments. All of these will be welcomed by my Greenock and Inverclyde constituents. It's something that they have been lobbying me for, and I have lobbied the Scottish Government for, and I welcome them. The introduction of the new post-school education reform bill aimed to tackle economic inactivity and skill shortages in our workforce and remove barriers to employment was also one of the areas highlighted by the Inverclyde Socio-Economic Task Force to the Scottish Government. So I'm sure that they will also welcome this new bill coming in. Now, reviewing Creative Scotland will be welcomed widely, and as a former member of the Parliamentary Committee that engaged with the body, I'm sure that I will not be alone in the Chamber in hoping that the review considers how the body can ensure how it is embedded in the towns and villages across the country, and not just in the cities. Now, Presiding Officer, this is a programme for government that will assist many of my constituents, and also individuals across the country. So I support it. And despite over 14 years of austerity under the Tories, and austerity 2.0 now underway by Labour, I was shocked by the admission earlier from Anas Sarwar when he said he was, and I quote, optimistic about the future. His read my lips no austerity under Labour defies comprehension when his London boss tells everyone the upcoming Labour budget will be painful and things will only get worse. So I will ensure, Mr Sarwar, I will ensure that when I am talking to my constituents, when folk are going to local food bank for the collection days, and also when pensioners are struggling to actually heat their homes, I will let them know that you are optimistic about their future. Thank you.
Thank you. We move to winding up speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I think we've heard a few familiar tunes this afternoon from the Conservatives. The familiar tune that we need to be spending much more on everything but raising much less tax. That's no great surprise there. From the Labour Party, who used to recognise the context of its austerity being imposed by a Tory UK government, now that it's a Labour UK government that's imposing Tory fiscal rules, that context seems a bit less relevant somehow. So their tune might be changing a little, but not necessarily for the better. As for the SNP, the First Minister tells us he wants to govern harder and stronger. I'm not really sure what that means, but I certainly think it shouldn't mean I certainly think it shouldn't mean abandoning the most marginalised in our society, and I'm afraid there is starting to be an element of that creeping into the government's programme. Not just some of the recent decisions, such as cutting the provision of free bus travel for asylum seekers. Such a small amount of money that policy costs. Such a small amount of money, but such a massive benefit to the individuals affected. But it's now entirely unclear what the government's position going forward on free school meals is going to be. It would be helpful if the government could respond on that in the closing. There now appear to be threats to water down rent controls. And I'm quite sure that the landlord lobby are working overtime to ensure that profiteering in the private rented sector can continue. But it's essential that the government and the Parliament stands up for tenants' rights if those amendments seek to water it down. I'm pleased that the Creative Scotland cuts have been reversed, but the huge anxiety that's been created during that period was entirely avoidable. And the decision to abandon the commitment to legislate in Scotland on conversion practices, which my colleague referred to. I see that the Equality Network have already responded, saying that the benefits of a Four Nations approach do not make up for the downsides of waiting for a Westminster bill, namely the Scottish Government losing control of the bill's content and timeline. I give way.
Shirley Ann Somerville.
I hope to be able to reassure the member that the Scottish Government continues to work on a Scottish bill on ending conversion practices. We do hope to take it forward on a Four Nations approach, but if that is not possible, the work is continuing, the pace has not changed, and we will continue that work, and I look forward to working with Green colleagues on that.
Patrick Harvey.
I think the Cabinet Secretary as an individual is someone who is fully committed to the principle, but the Government needs to be fully committed to the principle and to the reality of introducing that bill here to the Scottish Parliament and letting us legislate on it. I want to move on and talk about some of the other things that aren't in there. The Human Rights Bill isn't in there, and that's also been criticised by some people outside the Chamber. It does lose us the opportunity. It loses us the opportunity to legislate for the right to a healthy environment. Perhaps the government decided that legislating for the right to a healthy environment at the same time as raiding the Nature Restoration Fund would have lacked credibility. The Nature Restoration Fund, which I remind Rachel Hamilton, who's such a fan of it, the Greens created that as a result of the Butte House Agreement that I know she's so obsessed with. As for the climate bill, we know that a new climate bill is going to be necessary. It needs to be a moment of radical honesty, of Scotland acknowledging that we are years behind where we should be on emissions reduction because there hasn't been that willingness. At a political level, there hasn't been the political will to change transport policy, the way we heat our buildings, the way we use land and what kind of agriculture we subsidise. So a new bill, if it's going to be tolerable, if it's going to be supportable, has to be in the context of an acceleration of immediate action, not waiting until after carbon budgets are set, after advice has been taken and after a new climate plan has been produced. That would leave paralysis for most of the rest of this parliamentary session, if not longer. So if a new climate change bill is to seek political support from this part of the Chamber, it will need to be in the context of a radical acceleration of climate action in the short term. Presiding Officer, in closing, let me just say that there are warning signs since the SNP moved into, by choice, moved into minority government, that they seem determined now to abandon the trust of those Scots who wanted a progressive, equal Scotland, a Scotland that's willing to redistribute wealth in order to tackle austerity and that's willing to invest in bold and urgent climate action. As my colleague Lorna Slater said, there is still 18 months in which to prove those fears wrong and to commit to the bold action that's necessary. If the SNP abandons that project, the Greens certainly won't.
Thank you, and I call on Jackie Bailey. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's safe to say it's been a long summer, one that should occasion a period of reflection for the SNP, and you would of course expect to see recognition of that in the programme for government. The SNP went from 48 MPs in the UK Parliament to now only having 9 MPs. And that's what happens when voters think you have nothing to offer them. Whether it's the disappointment for indeed some of their members that after 17 years the SNP are no closer to delivering independence, or the more recent problems with Police Scotland, or whether it's the very real anger at the lack of competence in government. Voters are angry at the failure to deliver even the most basic of services, and that anger is focused by the SNP's record of government in Holyrood. The lack of progress in tackling NHS waiting lists, the continuing attainment gap, the housing emergency, and increasing numbers of people sleeping rough on our streets. All these failures, the responsibility of this SNP government. And people in communities across the country are being offered no hope, no vision, no ideas for making their lives better for the future. That is so depressing when Scotland and its people have so much potential. Scotland's best days do lie ahead of it, but will not be realised with this depressing, incompetent government. Let's look at the charge sheet, Presiding Officer. Let me start with the financial position. Yesterday, the Finance Secretary went through contortions to tell us that she wasn't to blame for any of the problems with the almost £1 billion shortfall in her budget. It was all Westminster's fault, and it was the fault of a UK Labour government that has been in office for 8 weeks. 8 weeks. It was nothing to do with decisions she or her predecessors made. Go look somewhere else to lay the blame, she said. Shame that she ignored what the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the Fraser of Allender Institute, the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Audit Scotland had all said. These are decisions she and her government made that are coming home to roost. And Michael Maher is right to call her out yesterday for diverting the £450 million of ScotWind money, because this is a one-off payment. It needs to be found again in the new financial year, and this will have an effect on the delivery of the programme for government. Can I say as gently as I can to the Cabinet Secretary for Health that actually he should spend more time listening and reflecting than trying to interrupt me? Pam Duncan-Glancy in her contribution highlighted the paucity of thinking by the SNP on education. Everything from the failure to close the attainment gap to the removal of hundreds of teachers from the classroom. The First Minister also told us about changes he is making to the ministerial code in the context of the secrecy and lack of transparency he was responsible for during the Salmond inquiry. This is just beyond funny. But what about the recommendation from James Hamilton Casey that special advisers should be subject to elements of the ministerial code? Oh no, nothing there at all from John Swinney. Let me turn to health, where the SNP's failures are most stark, and Neil Gray should listen. Waiting lists.
Miss Bailey. Thank you. Can we all hear how the chamber is just now? Let's imagine that, and the one person who's been called to speak is speaking. Miss Bailey.
Thank you so much, Presiding Officer. Waiting lists now at a staggering 864,000 people. 1 in 6 of our fellow Scots, the highest on record. But the Scottish Government promised to bring waiting lists down in the last programme for government. Another SNP failure. Delayed discharge, also at a record high, and it wasn't so long ago that the Finance Secretary was Health Minister and declared that delayed discharge would end. Another SNP failure. Or what about cancer treatment targets? The 62-day target has not been met in 12 years since it was introduced. Now the 31-day target is being missed. Another SNP failure. Delays in A&E are now normalised. Winter pressures are now all year round. Another SNP failure. And the use of the private sector has almost doubled, with 36% of all hip and knee operations done privately because people cannot wait any longer in pain. I welcome very much the attitude taken by the SNP government when they keep protesting that they are not creating a two-tier health service. But that is exactly what this SNP government is presiding over. Let me thank the staff who work for the NHS for all that they do. They are let down by this government, and so too are patients, as excess deaths are up and the government failure is literally costing lives. And what the Finance Secretary really didn't want to talk about yesterday were the cuts that health boards are having to make right now. Caroline Lamb, Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, told health boards in June that the expectation for is a £1.1 billion shortfall in the NHS budget. In Greater Glasgow and Clyde alone, the deficit is about £226 million. This will impact on frontline services and staff. The Finance Secretary said that essential staff would be protected. So why then are vacancies for nurses and consultants frozen? I didn't get an answer from her yesterday, so maybe she can try again because this is going on under her nose. And as the staff are not replaced, so the pressure on those that remain increases and they risk burnout. Cuts to mental health services, cuts to primary care, cuts to services for disabled people. Have this government no shame at all? All this government has is a sticking plaster approach, no vision and no solutions. And as Sawa was right, it's clear that the SNP government has lost its way and its incompetence is failing the people of Scotland. This programme for government is a missed opportunity, but then so too was the last one. It effectively demonstrates that the SNP record is one of abandoning its flagship pledges, missing its own targets and leaving every institution in Scotland weaker. The SNP presiding officer are out of ideas, they're out of time, and the people of Scotland increasingly want them out of office too.
Thank you, and I call on Craig Hoy. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate has taken place in the week that the chickens have come home to roost for the First Minister and his failing government. On their watch, Scotland has become a high-tax, low-growth economy. Public services are crumbling, unable to cope after 17 years of the SNP's incompetence and mismanagement. Drug deaths, unmentioned by the First Minister, are soaring. Waiting times remain high. The pupil attainment gap is growing. Lifeline ferries have failed to be delivered. All of this combined to produce the SNP's reverse Midas touch, a unique ability to spend more and at the same time deliver less. And as my colleagues Douglas Ross and Liz Smith rightly said, this government has mismanaged the tax system, mismanaged public sector pay negotiations, mismanaged largely unreformed public services, and it has woefully mismanaged the public finances. And as Rachel Hamilton said, it is no surprise, therefore, that the Finance Secretary was yesterday forced to come to this Parliament to reveal a £1 billion in-year budget black hole. A black hole of the SNP's making and their making alone. A black hole that Shona Robertson conceded will have a profound effect on this government's ability to deliver public services and public service reform. And yet, the First Minister confirmed this weekend that one of the only areas to be protected from the SNP's cuts agenda is the Scottish Government's independence unit. They are still prioritising spending on party political propaganda at the expense of Scotland's patients and Scotland's pupils. Now, I listened carefully to SNP members today, to Michelle Thompson, to Stuart McMillan, Kenneth Gibson and Emma Harper, and they all played the blame game. Frankly, I do not know what is in the water on the SNP floors of this building, but there has been a sudden and severe outbreak of delusion amongst its MSPs. And contrary to... I will give way.
Michelle Thompson.
I'm merely pointing out that the macro economy resides with Westminster. And you make the point about the Scottish Government's budget. It has to operate to a fixed budget, and yet the UK Government consistently has borrowed massively to the extent to which debt to GDP is now 88.8%. How's that for fiscal rectitude?
Craig Hoy.
In part, that borrowing was to fund this country through the COVID pandemic, and in part to make sure that we are properly funding public services.
Let's hear Mr. Hoy.
But Mr. Swinney has been Finance Secretary for long enough to realise that he has to balance the books. But contrary to what has happened, Mr. Swinney, this didn't arrive. This budget deficit did not arise by chance. It didn't arise because of Westminster. It didn't arise because of Brexit or the war in Ukraine. It arrived because the SNP government has repeatedly made a series of bad decisions and wrong calls on the pace and scale of public sector reform, on tax. No, I won't at the moment. I will come to you in a minute. No, I will come to you in a minute. I will give way if Mr Swinney can answer this simple question. Why are Scots today being taxed more when your government delivers less?
Well,
First Minister.
That's not the case because, well, in Scotland, people have eligibility for more access to early learning and childcare than in any other part of the United Kingdom. Young people get to university without paying tuition fees. Mr Hoy and his colleagues don't pay for prescription fees. There's an availability of free personal care for the elderly. That's what people get for their taxes in Scotland, which they don't get in any other part of the United Kingdom. But a question I wanted to ask Mr Hoy was this. Does he believe that the shocking economic performance of the public finances in the United Kingdom has anything to do with Liz Truss's budget, the war in Ukraine, COVID pandemic and the spiralling inflation as a consequence of Conservative decisions? Because if it has, his attack on the SNP government is absolutely fatuous.
Craig Hoy.
This is John Swinney's programme for government. These are John Swinney's cuts and he needs to own them. Presiding officer, this is John Swinney's first and perhaps his last programme for government.
Let's hear Mr Hoy.
And it is very thin indeed. Now, there are some elements that can be cautiously welcomed. The renewed commitment to our policy of free ports, Mr Swinney, an additional £100 million for more mid-market homes, but only after they slashed the housing budget last year. The focus on the further education sector and enhancing Scotland's skills, something long neglected by the SNP. Changes to the ministerial code so the First Minister no longer sits in judgment on himself, although I note that this Parliament will still have no role in that process. I also welcome the First Minister's renewed emphasis on reducing child poverty. Who wouldn't? But what is really going to change? How are we going to tackle the root causes of that poverty? Poor housing, poor pupil attainment and stubborn social stains, such as the effects of drug and alcohol misuse. In fact, this programme for government, as Pam Duncan-Glancy said, waters down the government's commitment to reducing the attainment gap. And in truth, 1 in 4 Scottish children are still living in relative poverty, light years away from the target of 10% by 2030 set by this government. And the government's own analysis says that the number of children growing up in poverty in Scotland today is broadly stable. In other words, despite all the extra expenditure, child poverty levels are the same or even higher than when the SNP came to power in 2007. Billions have been spent, but yet the dial is shifting in the wrong direction. This morning, the Finance Secretary appeared on radio to blame everybody but herself for her swingeing cuts. She repeatedly insisted that the SNP was investing in welfare and investing in public sector pay. Noble that this may be, but if these policies don't improve outcomes, then they are not sustainable. And if they are not sustainable, then they cannot be classed as an investment. If investment in welfare is working, why are so many Scottish children still living in poverty? If investment in public sector pay is working, why has there been no improvement in productivity or service delivery? Why has the SNP not taken on board the advice of Audit Scotland and embarked on root and branch reform of the public sector? Why is the centrepiece of this programme for government not a bold and urgent and wide-reaching public sector performance and productivity bill designed to deliver real change in the way that we deliver public services? Instead, we get the vague commitment to a 10-year reform programme. Why are NHS waiting lists in Scotland so long, given, as the First Minister says, we've avoided strikes and we pay more to our NHS staff? Because, bluntly, SNP ministers have failed to rebuild, reform and renew our NHS. In truth, this is a First Minister leading a government that is simply not up to the job of delivering reform. Because this is not a programme for government. This is a programme for managed decline. Or, under John Swinney, mismanaged decline. Yesterday, we found out they're out of money. Today, we find out they're out of ideas. An intellectually bankrupt First Minister leading a financially bankrupt government.
Thank you. And I call on Kate Forbes to wind up to 10 minutes, Deputy First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, this programme for government sets out our commitment to deliver, focusing on 4 key priorities: eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, tackling the climate emergency, and ensuring high-quality, sustainable public services. And it does come against a difficult backdrop, a backdrop of an ongoing cost of living crisis, war in Europe, and decisions by the UK Government to address its own £22 billion funding shortfall, all of which has studiously been ignored by the opposition in their comments this afternoon. Michelle Thompson captured some of the other challenges that we have: inflation, the failure of budgets to keep pace with inflation, costs continuing to rise, before we talk about the self-inflicted budget decisions of Liz Truss. It looks like the Conservatives are still not facing up to reality. But despite that, we have set out a serious, clear and focused agenda to deliver for communities. It recognises our many strengths. That is surely a point we can agree on across the Chamber. Scotland's inward investment projects, which is more than rhetoric, grew by 12.7% in 2023. That's compared to 6% across the UK and a 4.5% fall across Europe. Thankfully, those investors ignore the opposition's rhetoric. We've also seen a yes, I will.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm very grateful to the Deputy First Minister for giving way. One of our many strengths, as she puts it, that we can all agree on, is our tremendous renewable potential, generation and otherwise. But yesterday we saw the Scottish Government plug half of the hole in our national finances with the remainder of all of the revenue that was given from the licensing and the leasing of our seabed. Can she tell this Chamber what plans the Scottish Government have to plug that same hole in next year's budget?
I can tell the member about the £500 million that we're investing in offshore energy, including £67 million this year alone. I can talk about the fact that a Japanese company have invested £350 million in a cable factory. I can talk about the international investors that have invested in the port of Ardseer for the first time in decades, because we have seen a record number of foreign direct investment projects here in Scotland, top performing part of the UK outside London for 9 years. The point is that international investors look to Scotland, they see projects that they can be proud of, and they invest their funding because they see Scotland's strengths. Now, all parts of Scotland, I believe, and all parties perhaps in this chamber, recognise that Scotland does have a wealth of natural resources. It has great talent. It has got community cohesion. And building on that, this programme for government wants to deliver prosperity, prosperity with a purpose. That purpose is to eradicate child poverty, ensure that our public services are sustainable, and to reach that net zero target. That is our clear aim and objectives. Now, Jackie Baillie talked about the charge sheet. And the sad thing for the Labour Party is that, yes, I agree with Anna Sarmar, we only have 8 weeks to go on. But in those 8 weeks, we went from a position of promising change, that things will only get better, to a Prime Minister articulating himself that things will get worse. They were elected on a promise to reject austerity. We've already heard, read my lips. The Chancellor is the only person that appears to be surprised by the black hole in the UK's finances. And as Anna Sarwar rightly said, that although they've only been in power for 8 weeks, that's still enough time to strip pensioners of winter fuel payments. Pensioners. And it's enough time to turn a promise to reduce energy bills by £300 into an actual delivery of increasing energy bills by £149.
Michael Mara.
Does the Deputy First Minister not recognise that the job of fixing the public finances is the first priority of the UK Labour Government? It was once her first priority, and her plan was ditched, and that's why we're in the mess that we are now. Is that not right?
Deputy First Minister.
On the contrary, it amuses me when you have the opposition simultaneously accusing us of underspending and overspending at the same time. We are a very proud government to have ensured every penny is spent in serving Scotland, providing 1140 hours of high-quality early learning and childcare, providing free bus travel for over 2 million people, offering free school meals and 5 family payments in terms of restoring dignity at the heart of our welfare system. These are initiatives that aren't all available elsewhere in the UK because we have pushed the spending envelope as far as possible because of the values that we stand on to eradicate child poverty, to deliver prosperity and to reach net zero. Now, Presiding Officer, I wanted to talk about how we will build on our strengths, the strengths that hopefully all of us are agreed on here in Scotland to unlock Scotland's potential and deliver our aims. And we have set out a priority list of 3 areas in the economy to do that. And before I get onto that, I will take my last intervention.
I'm grateful to the Deputy First Minister for giving way. She's speaking about building and priorities. Can she confirm, or otherwise, do the SNP still believe in fully dualling the A96 from Aberdeen to Inverness, and when will that be delivered? Because the promise was 2030.
Deputy First Minister.
Can I say to the member that as somebody who lives in the Highlands and who values the North, I absolutely agree with our commitment to upgrade and to improve the A9 and the A96. In terms of our programme of delivering economic prosperity with a purpose, there's 3 areas, Presiding Officer, I wanted to talk about. The first is a coordinated programme to attract investment in delivering net zero, building housing and to improving our infrastructure. The second is to ensure that the decision-making process is accelerated and streamlined, with creating, for example, a planning hub and building capacity and resilience into the system. And the last is to support our people, to support entrepreneurs, to support more women into business, and to ensure that we embed fair work in everything that we do. And with the few minutes I have remaining, I wanted to go through each of these individually. On investment, we know that our public finances are constrained, and so our commitment is to leverage and stimulate private investment with that coordinated programme to implement recommendations from the investor panel, to improve engagement with investors, to strengthen our capacity and capability in delivering and exploring new funding mechanisms such as blended finance and guarantees to ensure that there is a national project pipeline of investment opportunities. Very specifically looking at housing, we will invest £100 million to grow to £500 million with institutional investment to deliver at least 2,800 mid-market rent homes on top of the public investment that we are putting in to affordable housing. Secondly, on the decision-making, we know, look at the figures, that people want to invest in Scotland. So our commitment is to streamline and accelerate those opportunities, to support early adopters to develop a master plan consent area, front-loading consents, including planning permission, including for housing, and to ensure that there is enough planners in the system with a planned apprenticeship programme to invest in new talent. That sits alongside the work we're doing with communities to create local employment through the Community Wealth Building Bill. And then thirdly, Presiding Officer, on entrepreneurship, to build on the Tech Scaler programme, to support more women to start and grow a business, to integrate the tech scalers into manufacturing and industry so that we aren't creating jobs elsewhere with our talent and ingenuity. They are coming here to Scotland. And we will develop our strengths in data, digital, AI, health and life sciences to not only create jobs and deliver economic prosperity, but also to solve the big problems in the health service. And anyone who wants an example of that need only look at Scottish Brain Sciences, who have recently come to Scotland and whose aim is to cure Alzheimer's, working here in Scotland with the NHS using that talent and ingenuity. And so, Presiding Officer, as I come to a close, there are a number of areas in the programme for government which are truly exciting. Michael Mara talked about the importance of our creative artists and our culture sector, absolutely, which is why it's great news that Angus Robertson has announced the release of £6.6 million, including £3 million towards the Open Fund, and a review of Creative Scotland to ensure that we support that sector as much as possible. And so, Presiding Officer, as I come to a conclusion, I would hope that everyone across the chamber believes in delivering prosperity. And there is no greater purpose for that prosperity than to eradicate poverty and to lift the next generation of children out of poverty, to embed fairness across Scotland. We have much that we could dedicate time to in terms of our challenges and the issues that families are grappling with. But this is a programme for government that is built on optimism, on confidence and a clarity of vision. We'll always employ every penny at our disposal to lift children out of poverty and to ensure we reach our other objectives. We cannot be accused of underspending and overspending at the same time. This is a programme for government that will use everything at our disposal to deliver for Scotland in the service of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on programme for government. Point of order, Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I seek your advice on an intervention from Christine Graham earlier in the debate. She suggested that a Conservative-led Scottish Borders local authority was responsible for an affordable housing supply underspend. This, Presiding Officer, was incorrect. The Conservative-led Scottish Borders Council does not manage housing stock. It is managed by the Register Social Landlords, and this underspend of £8 million reflected a number of development challenges that those particular registered social housing landlords had. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The member will be aware that points of order should be used to inquire as to whether proper parliamentary procedures are being or have been followed. The content of members' contributions and the accuracy thereof are a matter for members, and members will know that a mechanism exists for correction where that is required. That concludes the debate on Programme for Government 2024 to 2025, and we'll now move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 14305 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. And I call on the Minister to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 14305 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 14306 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on a Stage 2 timetable. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press their request to speak button. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 14306 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of 3 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I ask Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move motions 14307 on approval of an SSI, 14308 on committee membership, and 14309 on office of the clerk.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. And the question on these motions will be put at decision time, and there's one question to be put as a result of today's business. I propose to ask a single question on 3 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does any member object? No. The question, therefore, is that motions 14307 on approval of an SSI, 14308 on committee membership, and 14309 on office of the clerk in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motions are therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time, and we'll now move on to members' business in the name of Bob Doris. I'd be grateful if those leaving the chamber could do so quietly.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.